Jonah Mercer stood frozen as the wagon door swung open, his heart sinking like a stone in a well. The woman who stepped down wasn't Sarah, the schoolteacher from Boston he'd written to for 6 months. Instead, a hollow-eyed widow clutched a baby to her chest while 4 more children tumbled out behind her like refugees from a broken dream. "I'm Mara Ellison," she whispered, voice cracking. "Sarah was my sister. She's dead." Everything Jonah had hoped for shattered in that single moment. Stay with us until the end to see how this impossible situation transforms into something neither of them expected, and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The New Mexico sun hammered down on the town of Redemption Springs like God's own judgment, turning the dirt streets into ribbons of shimmering heat. Jonah Mercer had been standing outside the general store for the better part of an hour, his hat brim pulled low, his jaw tight with anticipation that made his teeth ache. He'd bathed that morning, twice, put on his only good shirt, the one without patches on the elbows. Even trimmed his beard, though his hand had shaken so badly he'd nicked himself twice. The small cuts still stung in the dry air, but he didn't care. Today was the day. After 6 months of careful letters, of pouring his heart onto paper by lamplight, of imagining a future that didn't echo with loneliness, today, Sarah was coming. Sarah Ellison, schoolteacher from Boston, 26 years old, never married, with handwriting like lacework and words that made him feel less like a rough-handed rancher and more like a man worthy of being loved. She'd described herself as plain but pleasant, which had made him smile because he'd described himself as weathered but honest. They'd been perfect strangers building something real through ink and hope. "Stage is late," old Chester Polk said from his rocking chair outside the store, tobacco juice dribbling into his beard. "Probably got held up at the river crossing." Jonah didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the eastern road where dust devils danced in the heat shimmer. His ranch sat 12 miles outside town, a modest spread with decent water and grass enough for his small herd. It wasn't much, but it was his. Built with his own hands after the war, every fence post and roof beam a testament to survival. He'd thought it would be enough to live there alone, to tend his cattle and his solitude in equal measure. But 3 winters of talking only to himself and his horse had worn him down to nothing. The silence had teeth. It bit deeper every night. So he'd done what desperate men do. He'd answered an advertisement in the Denver Post. "Respectable gentlemen seeking companionship may write to..." The words had felt like a lifeline thrown into dark water, and Sarah had written back, "Dear Mr. Mercer." Her first letter had begun, "I confess I am not certain what to write to a stranger, but perhaps that is what we both need. A fresh beginning with no shadows of the past to darken it." Her past, she'd explained carefully, included a broken engagement to a lawyer who'd decided she was too bookish and insufficiently decorative. Jonah's past included a war that had carved pieces out of his soul and a family all buried in Tennessee before he'd turned 23. They'd understood each other in the way damaged things recognize their own kind. "There!" Chester lurched forward in his chair. "That's the stage!" Jonah's heart kicked against his ribs like a trapped animal. The Butterfield coach crested the rise, dust billowing behind it like a bride's train. His hands were sweating. When had his hands ever sweated? He wiped them on his trousers and felt foolish, felt like a green boy instead of a 34-year-old man who'd survived Shiloh and built a life from nothing. The coach slowed, the driver hauling back on the reins with a shouted, "Whoa!" The horses stamped and snorted, their sides dark with sweat. The whole town seemed to be watching now, curtains twitching in windows, people finding excuses to be outside. Everyone knew Jonah Mercer was collecting a mail-order bride today. The gossip had been running for weeks. The driver climbed down, opened the coach door, and Jonah's world tilted sideways. The woman who emerged wasn't Sarah. She was younger, maybe 22 or 23, with dark hair escaping a bun that had given up any pretense of order somewhere between here and wherever she'd come from. Her dress was travel-stained and too thin for the high desert, her face pale beneath the dust that coated everything. She clutched a bundle wrapped in a faded shawl. A baby, Jonah realized with dawning horror, and her eyes swept the crowd with the desperate look of someone who'd already lost everything and was bracing for the next blow. "Ma!" A boy of maybe 9 or 10 scrambled out after her, followed by 3 more children in descending sizes like a set of broken stairs. A girl of 7 or 8, another boy around 6, and a tiny girl who couldn't have been more than 4. They clustered around the woman like chicks around a hen, all of them dusty and hollow-eyed and staring at Redemption Springs as if it were the last place on earth. Which, for them, it probably was. Jonah couldn't move. His boots had grown roots into the boardwalk. The driver was hauling down a pitiful collection of bags and bundles, everything these people owned, apparently, which wasn't much. The woman's eyes found his. He didn't know how she knew. Maybe it was the way he was dressed, or the flowers he'd bought that now felt stupid and small in his hand, or just the naked shock on his face. But she knew. She took 2 steps toward him, the baby squirming against her chest, and stopped. "Mr. Mercer?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, roughened by dust or tears or both. "Yes." The word came out strangled. "I'm Mara Ellison." She swallowed hard, her throat working like it hurt. "Sarah was my sister." Was. Past tense. The word hung between them like smoke from a gunshot. "She caught fever in St. Louis," Mara continued, her voice getting smaller with each word. 3 weeks ago, I did everything, but she—" Her voice cracked clean through. "I'm sorry. I came because she made me promise. She said you were waiting, and she couldn't bear the thought of you waiting for someone who'd never come." The baby started to cry, a thin, exhausted sound that made something twist in Jonah's chest. Mara bounced it automatically, not even looking down, her eyes still locked on his face like she was waiting for the blow to fall. Behind her, the children huddled together. The oldest boy, skinny as a fence rail, all elbows and knees, had his arms around the 2 youngest, trying to shield them from the stares of the townspeople. The middle girl was crying silently, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Jonah felt every eye in Redemption Springs on him, felt the weight of expectation and judgment, and barely concealed glee at the spectacle of his mail-order bride plan going so thoroughly, catastrophically wrong. He'd asked for a wife, a partner, someone to share the silence with, to build something with. He'd gotten a widow and 5 children who looked like they hadn't eaten a decent meal in weeks. "Mr. Mercer, Mara's voice wavered. "I didn't know what else to do. Sarah told me about your letters, about your ranch. She said you were a good man. I thought—" She stopped, bit her lip hard enough to draw blood. "If you could just point us to the nearest boarding house, or perhaps the church, I'm sure we can find—" "There's no boarding house," Jonah heard himself say. His voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere outside his body. "Church is just the schoolhouse on Sundays." Mara's face went even paler, if that was possible. The baby's crying intensified. Chester Polk was watching with undisguised fascination, probably already composing the story he'd tell at the saloon tonight. Across the street, Widow Hutchins stood with her arms crossed, her expression radiating righteous disapproval. 2 of the shopkeepers had come out to their doorways. The oldest boy, the one trying to protect his siblings, looked up at Jonah with eyes that were trying hard to be brave but failing. He couldn't have been more than 9, but he looked ancient with worry. Jonah thought about sending them away. Thought about pointing Mara toward the stage office and telling her this wasn't what he'd signed up for, wasn't what he'd spent 6 months dreaming about in his lonely ranch house. He thought about his orderly life, his quiet routines, his small herd of cattle that needed no explaining to. Then he looked at Mara again, really looked at her. At the exhaustion in every line of her body, the way she held that baby like it was the only solid thing in a world gone to water. At the stubborn set of her jaw that said she'd walked through hell and wouldn't apologize for arriving on the other side still breathing. She'd kept her dead sister's promise. She'd traveled God knew how many miles with 5 children and probably no money, because Sarah had asked her to, because she couldn't bear the thought of a stranger, Jonah, waiting and hoping for nothing. "You hungry?" The words came out before he could stop them. Mara blinked. "What? Are you hungry? The children?" He gestured awkwardly at the small crowd of them. "There's a restaurant down the street. Nothing fancy, but it's decent." "Mr. Mercer, I can't. We don't have money for—" "I'm buying." He said it firmly, cutting off her protest. "You came all this way. Least I can do is feed you before we figure out what comes next." What comes next? Mara repeated faintly. Jonah didn't have an answer to that, didn't have the first clue what came next. But he knew he couldn't stand here in the middle of town watching a woman and 5 children starve while everyone waited to see what the hermit rancher would do. Come on. He turned toward the restaurant without waiting to see if she'd follow. After a moment, he heard the shuffle of small feet and the squeak of worn shoes on the boardwalk behind him. The restaurant, calling it that was generous, it was really just Martha Simmons's front room with 5 tables, went quiet when they walked in. Martha herself, a sturdy woman with flour permanently embedded in the creases of her hands, looked up from the stove and her eyes went wide. Jonah Mercer, she said slowly, heard you were expecting company. Martha. He nodded toward the largest table, the one by the window. These folks need feeding. I can see that. Martha's gaze traveled over Mara and the children with an expression Jonah couldn't quite read. Not unkind, but not warm either. Calculating, maybe. How many? 7. The number felt surreal coming out of his mouth. 7. Martha wiped her hands on her apron. Well, sit yourselves down. I've got stew and cornbread. Coffee for the adults, milk for the little ones. The children didn't move until Mara nodded at them. Then they scrambled for the chairs like they were afraid the offer might evaporate. The oldest boy helped the youngest girl into her seat, tucking her in with a tenderness that made Jonah's throat tight. Mara sat last, the baby still clutched to her chest. She looked like she might shatter if someone breathed on her wrong. You can set the baby down, Martha said, not unkindly. I'll fetch a basket you can lay him in. Her, Mara corrected quietly. Rose. Her name is Rose. Pretty name. Martha disappeared into the back room and returned with a laundry basket lined with clean towels. Here. She'll be safe enough. Mara hesitated, then carefully lowered the baby into the basket. Rose, tiny and red-faced and squalling, immediately quieted, as if she too was too exhausted to sustain her protest. Jonah sat across from Mara, the children ranged between them like a buffer zone. Up close, he could see the toll the journey had taken. Mara's hands trembled as she folded them in her lap. There were shadows under her eyes dark enough to be bruises. Her dress, which had probably been respectable once, was torn at the hem and missing 2 buttons. This is Eli, Mara said suddenly, her voice too bright, too desperate to fill the silence. She put her hand on the oldest boy's shoulder. And that's Clara, Thomas, and June. And baby Rose, of course. Pleased to meet you, Jonah said formally, directing it at the children. Eli stared at him with those 2 old eyes. Clara wiped at her face, smearing the tears and dust into a muddy mess. Thomas, the middle boy, had his thumb in his mouth despite being 6 years old, and June just looked confused, like she couldn't quite remember how she'd ended up in this strange place. Martha brought bowls of stew, thick with beef and vegetables, and a platter of cornbread still steaming from the oven. The children fell on it like wolves, and Jonah had to look away from the desperation of it. When was the last time they'd eaten? Really eaten, not just scraps to keep their bellies from touching their spines. Mara ate slowly, mechanically, her eyes on her children as if she could only swallow if she confirmed they were swallowing too. Jonah watched her over his own bowl, this stranger who'd crashed into his carefully constructed life like a meteor into a still pond. She had a widow's ring on her left hand, a thin gold band worn almost smooth. How long had she been widowed? Sarah had never mentioned it in her letters, but then Sarah had barely mentioned having a sister at all. She'd talked about her teaching position, her love of books, her dream of somewhere wild and open where rules didn't press so close. She'd never mentioned leaving behind a younger sister with 5 children and no husband. How long? Jonah asked before he could stop himself. Mara looked up, a spoonful of stew halfway to her mouth. I'm sorry? Your husband. How long? Her face shuddered like a house closing up for a storm. 14 months. 14 months. So she'd been dragging these children through the world alone for more than a year, and then Sarah had died and stranded them even further from anything resembling safety. The baby was born 2 months after he died. Mara set down her spoon very carefully, like it might shatter if she wasn't gentle with it. James never knew about her. He was a teamster. His wagon went off a mountain pass in Colorado. They didn't even... She stopped, swallowed hard. There wasn't enough left to bury properly. Christ. Jonah's own stew turned to ashes in his mouth. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. Mara shrugged, a tiny movement that encompassed more grief than any tears could have. Sarah came to help after Rose was born. She stayed for a few months, but then she said she'd written to you and you'd agreed to. She trailed off, waving one hand vaguely. She was going to send for us once she was settled, said there'd be room, that maybe you'd need help on the ranch, that the children could work for their keep. There it was, the plan that had died with Sarah somewhere in St. Louis. Jonah thought about his letters, his careful words about wanting a quiet life with someone who understood that silence wasn't the same as emptiness. Had Sarah misunderstood? Had she thought he was looking for a ready-made family, for the noise and chaos of children? Or had she simply been desperate to save her sister and seen Jonah as the only option? So you came anyway, he said, after she died. You brought them all the way here. I promised. Mara's voice was fierce suddenly, a spark of something unbreakable showing through the exhaustion. She made me promise I'd make sure you knew what happened, that you wouldn't be waiting for her, and The fierceness wavered. I didn't know what else to do. We had no money. The landlord was going to throw us out. I sold everything we had just to buy the tickets. I thought maybe... She looked away, blinking hard. I don't know what I thought. Jonah set down his spoon. Across the table, Eli was watching him with those ancient eyes, one arm around Thomas, the other around June, protecting them even now, even from whatever judgment or rejection might be coming. 9 years old and already the man of a family that kept breaking. Martha refilled the coffee cups without being asked, her presence a buffer against the weight of the conversation. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning its slide toward evening, painting the dusty street in shades of gold and amber. Jonah's ranch was a 2-hour ride from town. If he left now, he could be back before full dark, could sleep in his own bed, wake up to his usual routine, pretend this day had never happened. Leave Mara and 5 children in Redemption Springs with nowhere to go and no way to get there. He thought about Sarah's letters, about the careful hope they'd built together line by line. I think we could be happy, she'd written once. I think we could build something good. Sarah was dead, but her sister was here, staring at him with eyes that expected rejection, because rejection was all she'd known for 14 months. My ranch is 12 miles out, Jonah said slowly. 2 hours by wagon. It's not much. 3 rooms needs work, but there's space, and I could use help with the stock. The children, he looked at Eli. They old enough to work? Mara's breath caught. Mr. Mercer, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. He cut her off, gentler than he meant to. But you came all this way. Seems wrong to send you back to nothing. We'd work, Eli said suddenly, his voice cracking with the effort of speaking up. We'd work hard, sir. We wouldn't be trouble. Jonah looked at this boy, at the desperate hope trying to hide behind a 9-year-old's bravado, and felt something crack open in his chest. I believe you, he said. Mara was crying now, silent tears tracking through the dust on her face. She swiped at them impatiently, like they embarrassed her. We can't. She took a shaking breath. Why would you do this? You don't know us. We're nothing to you. Jonah thought about the war, about the men he'd fought beside who'd died in his arms, strangers bound together by nothing but the circumstance of being in the same hell at the same time, about the farm family that had taken him in after Shiloh, fed him, and sheltered him when he was too broken to even remember his own name, about how easy it was to walk away from suffering when it wasn't yours, and how much harder and how much more important it was to reach out a hand even when you didn't have to. Sarah wanted to help you, he said finally. She can't, but maybe I can. It wasn't romance. It wasn't the future he'd imagined, the quiet partnership with a school teacher who loved books and solitude as much as he did. It was messy and complicated and probably a mistake that would blow up in his face, but it was the right thing to do. Mara pressed her hands to her mouth, trying to stifle a sob. The children were all staring at Jonah now like he'd just promised them the moon. Just for a while, Mara managed finally. Until I can find work, save some money. We won't impose for long. Jonah nodded, though they both knew it was a pretty lie. Where was she going to find work in Redemption Springs? Who was going to hire a widow with 5 children and no skills but survival? But he let her have the dignity of the fiction. Martha cleared the bowls, her expression softening slightly. "You'll need supplies," she said to Jonah, "for feeding this many. I can put together an order if you want. Appreciate it." Jonah stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "We should get moving if we want to make the ranch before full dark." Mara gathered up baby Rose, and the children scrambled to follow. Jonah paid Martha, more than the meal cost, enough to cover the charity he knew she'd been extending, and led his unexpected household out into the golden afternoon. The wagon he'd brought to town, the one he'd cleaned and lined with blankets for Sarah's comfort, now held a different cargo. Mara sat on the bench beside him, the baby in her arms, while the 4 older children piled into the back among the bundles and bags. As they rolled out of Redemption Springs, Jonah could feel the eyes on them, could practically hear the gossip starting already, spreading through the town like wildfire. "Did you see?" Jonah Mercer took in that widow and her whole brood. "What's he thinking? Those aren't his children. That's not his wife. What kind of arrangement is that?" Mara must have felt it too, because she sat rigid beside him, staring straight ahead, her jaw tight enough to shatter teeth. "They'll talk," Jonah said quietly. "Town like this, they always do." "I know." Her voice was barely audible over the creak of the wagon wheels. "I'm sorry." "Nothing to be sorry for." He flicked the reins, urging the horses into a steady trot. "They talked about me plenty before you showed up. At least now they'll have something new to chew on." That startled a small, wet laugh out of her. She wiped her eyes again, keeping one arm tight around Rose. The land opened up around them, vast and empty and beautiful in its harshness. The mountains rose purple in the distance, the sky endless overhead. This was what Jonah loved about New Mexico, this sense of space and possibility. Out here, a man could breathe, could remake himself into whatever he needed to be. Even, apparently, an instant father to 5 orphaned children. "What do I call you?" Mara asked suddenly. Jonah glanced at her. "Jonah's fine. Or Mr. Mercer, if you're more comfortable with that." "Jonah," she repeated, testing it. Then quieter. "I'm Mara. Not Mrs. Ellison. Just Mara." "All right, Mara." They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the jingle of harness and the shuffle of the horses' hooves in the dust. In the back of the wagon, the children were quiet too, exhausted probably, or maybe just afraid to believe this reprieve was real. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and crimson. The temperature dropped with the light, and Jonah saw Mara shiver in her thin dress. "There's a blanket behind the seat," he said, "for you and the baby." She pulled it out, wrapped it around herself, and rose with fumbling hands. "Thank you." "Ranch will be warmer," Jonah said. "I keep a good fire going. I'm sure it's lovely." It wasn't lovely. It was functional at best. 3 rooms, like he'd said, with a leaky roof and windows that didn't quite fit their frames. But it was shelter, and right now, that was what mattered. The light was fading to purple by the time the ranch house came into view, a dark shape against the darkening land. Jonah's few cattle were dark shapes too, grazing in the near pasture. The barn stood solid and strong. He'd built that first, before the house, because livestock needed shelter before men did. Mara sat up straighter, peering at the property. "It's bigger than I expected." "Not much," Jonah said, "but it's mine. Clear title, no debt." That had been important to Sarah, he remembered. She'd asked in one of her letters whether he owned his land or was just working it for someone else. She'd wanted security, stability, the promise that the ground wouldn't shift beneath her feet again. He pulled the wagon up to the house and set the brake. The children tumbled out, stiff and sore from the long ride, looking around at their new home with wide, uncertain eyes. Jonah jumped down and came around to help Mara. She clutched Rose in one arm and took his hand with the other, her fingers cold despite the blanket. When her feet touched the ground, she swayed slightly, and he steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "All right?" "Just tired." But she smiled at him, a small, fragile thing that looked like it might break. "Thank you. For all of this. You didn't have to I know." He released her arm, stepped back. "Come on, let's get you all inside before it gets full dark." The house was dark and cold, the fire dead in the grate. Jonah lit a lamp and then another, pushing back the shadows. The main room was sparse, a table, a few chairs, his bedroll in the corner. The second room held supplies and tools, and the third was barely more than a closet. Mara looked around, her expression carefully neutral. The children huddled together, June clinging to Clara's hand. "It's not much," Jonah said, suddenly seeing it through her eyes. The bare walls, the rough floor, the complete absence of anything soft or welcoming. "It's wonderful," Mara said firmly. "It's shelter. That's more than we had this morning." Jonah busied himself building up the fire, giving her space to settle the children. He heard her soft voice directing them, telling them where to put their few belongings, assuring them that yes, this was real, they could stay. When the fire was blazing, he straightened and found Mara watching him, the baby asleep in her arms. "Where should we sleep?" she asked quietly. Jonah looked at his bedroll, then at the 6 people who needed space to lie down. "You and the girls take my bed. Boys can have the supply room. There's space to spread blankets. I'll sleep in the barn." "You can't sleep in the barn. This is your home." "Got a perfectly good hayloft. Slept there plenty of times." He grabbed his bedroll before she could argue further. "There's a pump out back for water. Privy's about 20 yards west. I'll bring in more wood before I bed down." He escaped before she could protest, stepping out into the cool night. The stars were coming out, hard and bright in the clear air. Jonah breathed deep, trying to settle the chaos spinning through his head. What had he done? What in God's name had he done? He'd invited strangers into his home, strangers with needs and expectations, and a whole tangled history he knew nothing about. He'd upended his entire life in the space of an afternoon, and for what? For a dead woman's promise? For the desperate eyes of a widow who reminded him too much of everyone he'd ever failed to save. But when he went back inside with an armload of firewood, he found Mara heating water in his battered pot, the baby sleeping in the laundry basket on the table. The children were spreading blankets in their designated spaces, their movements slow with exhaustion, but also something else. Hope, maybe. The fragile beginning of security. "I found beans and flour," Mara said. "If you don't mind, I thought I'd make some supper. The children are still hungry." Of course they were. Growing children were always hungry, and these ones probably hadn't been properly fed in longer than he wanted to think about. "Help yourself to whatever's here." Jonah stacked the wood by the fireplace. "I'll check on the stock, and then I'll be in the barn if you need anything." "Jonah?" She stopped him with his name, and he turned. "I meant what I said. We won't impose for long. As soon as I can find a way forward, we'll be out of your hair." He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe this was temporary, that his life would go back to normal soon. But looking at her, at this fierce, exhausted woman making supper in his kitchen like she belonged there, he had a sinking feeling that normal was already gone, burned away like morning fog in the New Mexico sun. "Get some rest," was all he said. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." Then he walked out into the night, leaving his house full of strangers and his future uncertain as smoke. The first morning broke cold and clear, frost glittering on the sage like scattered diamonds. Jonah woke in the hayloft to the sound of a baby crying, a thin, insistent wail that cut through the pre-dawn stillness. He lay there for a moment, disoriented, before memory crashed back. The widow. The children. His ranch that was no longer just his. He rolled out of his blankets, muscles stiff from the cold, and made his way down the ladder. Through the barn door, he could see lamplight already glowing in the kitchen window. Someone was awake. When he pushed through the door, stamping dirt from his boots, he found Mara at the stove, the baby on her hip, trying to coax the fire into cooperation with one hand. She jumped at the sound of the door, whirling around with eyes wide and startled. "I didn't mean to wake you," she said quickly. "Rose was hungry, and I thought I'd make some coffee, but the stove, it's different from what I'm used to, and I couldn't—" She gestured helplessly at the smoking firebox. "Damper's stuck," Jonah said, crossing to the stove. He jiggled the handle, adjusted the airflow, and the smoke cleared. "There. Should draw properly now." "Thank you." Mara bounced the baby, who was still fussing. "I'm sorry. I know you weren't expecting to be woken at dawn by a crying infant. Stock needs tending anyway." Jonah moved to the water bucket, splashed his face. The cold shocked him fully awake. "I'm usually up before first light." He could feel her watching him as he dried his face on a towel that had seen better days. When he glanced over, she looked away quickly, focusing on the baby. "The children are still asleep," she said. "I thought I'd let them rest. They were so exhausted." "Long journey." "Yes." She settled Rose against her shoulder, patting the baby's back in a rhythm that looked automatic, unconscious. "Jonah, I've been thinking about what I said yesterday, about work and earning our keep." He waited, pulling on his coat. "I can cook," Mara continued. "Not fancy, but decent. I can clean, mend clothes, tend a garden if you have one. The children, Eli's good with animals. Clara can help with washing and minding the little ones. Even Thomas can fetch water, gather eggs if you have chickens." "Don't have chickens." "Oh." Her face fell slightly. "Well, we can still help. I don't want you to think that we're going to be a burden with nothing to offer in return." Jonah studied her in the lamplight. She looked even more exhausted than yesterday, her face pale and drawn, shadows like bruises under her eyes. The baby must have kept her up half the night, but her spine was straight, her chin lifted with that stubborn pride he was beginning to recognize. "You got here yesterday," he said quietly. "Maybe take a day to settle before you start worrying about earning your keep." "I can't afford to wait." The words came out sharp, almost desperate. "Every day we're here is another day of obligation, another debt I can't repay. I need to—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "I need to pull my weight." The baby let out a wet burp, and Mara grimaced, reaching for a cloth to wipe Rose's mouth. Such a practiced movement, so weary and automatic. How many times had she done this in the past 2 months? How many times had she stood alone in some rented room, soothing a crying infant while trying to figure out how to feed 4 other children with no money and no help? "No debt," Jonah said firmly. "You're here because I invited you. That's not a debt." "But—" "Coffee's boiling over." Mara spun back to the stove with a small cry, grabbing the pot off the heat. The coffee hissed and spat, but she'd caught it in time. She poured 2 cups with shaking hands, passed one to Jonah. "Thank you," he said. They stood in awkward silence, sipping bitter coffee while the baby dozed against Mara's shoulder and the sun began to paint the eastern sky pink and gold. Jonah could hear stirring from the other rooms, the children waking up, whispered voices, the creak of floorboards. "I should get to the stock," he said finally, setting down his empty cup. "There's cornmeal in the pantry, bacon in the cold cellar out back. Make whatever you want for breakfast." "All right." Mara hesitated, then added quietly, "Jonah, thank you for the coffee, for everything." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and escaped into the clean simplicity of morning chores. The cattle were waiting at the water trough, patient and placid. Jonah checked them over with practiced efficiency, looking for injuries or illness, finding nothing but healthy stock. The work settled him, gave his hands something to do while his mind tried to adjust to the fact that his solitary life was now anything but. He was mucking out the barn when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find Eli standing in the doorway, backlit by morning sun, his thin frame almost lost in a coat several sizes too large. "Sir?" The boy's voice was tentative. "Ma said I should ask if you need help." Jonah leaned on his pitchfork, studying the child. 9 years old, maybe 10, with his father's widow's ring probably still warm in his mother's pocket and the weight of a family on his bony shoulders. The boy stood straight despite obvious nervousness, hands clenched at his sides. "You know anything about cattle?" Jonah asked. "No, sir, but I can learn." "Horses?" "Some. My pa—" Eli's voice caught. He cleared his throat. "My pa let me help with the team sometimes. Before." Before. Such a small word to contain so much loss. Jonah made a decision. "All right, come here." He spent the next hour teaching Eli the basics. How to approach a horse without spooking it, how to check hooves for stones, how to measure out grain. The boy was quick and careful, listening to every word like it was gospel. His hands were small but steady as he stroked the mare's nose, murmuring soft words the way Jonah had shown him. "She likes you," Jonah said. Eli's face lit up with the first real smile Jonah had seen from him. "Really?" "Wouldn't let you touch her otherwise. Horses know who to trust." The boy processed this, then looked up at Jonah with those two old eyes. Does that mean she trusts you too? We've known each other a while. How long have you had her? 3 years. Bought her off a trader passing through Redemption Springs. Jonah patted the mare's shoulder. Best decision I ever made. Good, steady animal. They worked in comfortable silence after that, Eli mimicking Jonah's movements, trying to do everything exactly right. When they finally headed back to the house, the boy was dusty and tired, but standing a little taller. Inside, chaos had erupted. Clara and Thomas were chasing each other around the table, shrieking with laughter, while June sat on the floor surrounded by a collection of Jonah's tools that she'd apparently liberated from somewhere. Mara was at the stove, the baby in one arm while she stirred something with the other, calling half-hearted warnings to the running children that they completely ignored. Everyone froze when Jonah walked in. Sorry, Mara said immediately, her cheeks flushing. They've been cooped up so long, and I thought... She gestured helplessly at the disorder. I'll get them settled. Clara, Thomas, stop that right now. The children slunk to the table, heads down. June scrambled to gather up the tools, her little face crumpling like she might cry. Jonah looked at the scattered tools, the running children, the general upheaval of his previously orderly home, and felt something in his chest shift. Not irritation, exactly. Something stranger and more complicated. It's fine, he heard himself say. Just maybe no running inside. House isn't big enough for it. Yes, sir, Clara whispered. And June. He crouched down to the little girl's level. She flinched back, clutching a wrench to her chest. Those tools are sharp. You can look at them, but ask first, all right? So I can show you which ones are safe. June's eyes went wide. You'll show me? If you want. She nodded so vigorously her braids bounced. Jonah took the wrench gently from her hands and set it aside, then helped her gather the rest of the tools into their proper box. When he straightened, Mara was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. Gratitude, maybe, mixed with something that looked almost like pain. Breakfast is ready, she said, her voice rough. It's not much, just cornmeal mush and bacon, but smells good. It did smell good, better than anything Jonah usually managed for himself. They crowded around the table, 7 people in a space meant for one, elbows bumping and dishes passing hand to hand. The children ate like they were still half afraid the food might vanish, shoveling it in with desperate efficiency. Slow down, Mara said gently to Thomas, who was eating so fast he was nearly choking. It's not going anywhere. But her own plate sat mostly untouched, Jonah noticed. She was too busy making sure the children had enough, that the baby wasn't fussing, that everyone else's needs were met before her own. Eat, he said to her, nodding at her plate. I'm not very hungry. Eat anyway. He said it firmly enough that she picked up her fork, though her hand trembled slightly. After breakfast, Jonah intended to get back to work. He had fence line that needed mending, hay that needed moving. But Eli shadowed him to the door, and then Clara appeared asking if she could help too, and suddenly he had 3 children trailing after him like ducklings, while Mara dealt with the little ones inside. Clara turned out to have a good eye for detail, spotting breaks in the fence wire that Jonah had missed. Thomas was too small for heavy work, but he gathered tools and carried water with fierce determination. Even Eli, for all his eagerness, tired quickly. He was too thin, underfed for too long, without the strength a boy his age should have. They worked through the morning, and Jonah found himself talking more than he had in months, explaining how to splice wire, why fence posts needed to be set a certain depth, how to read the land for water. The children listened like he was revealing the secrets of the universe. My pa used to say you could tell good land by the grass, Eli offered at one point, wiping sweat from his forehead. Your pa was right. What else did he say? Eli went quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was small. He said a man's worth is in his word, that if you say you'll do something, you do it, no matter what. That's true. He said, the boy's voice cracked. He said he'd always take care of us. But then he died. Clara had gone still, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Thomas had his thumb in his mouth again, a habit Jonah suspected he'd been shamed out of before but returned to under stress. Jonah set down his tools and crouched to Eli's level, the way he had with June that morning. Your pa didn't break his word, he said quietly. He would have kept that promise if he could. Sometimes things happen that are beyond a man's control. Doesn't mean he didn't mean what he said. But we're not taken care of, Eli said, and the raw pain in his voice was like a knife. Ma works so hard, and we don't even have a home. We're charity. We're a burden. Hey, Jonah gripped the boy's shoulder. You're not a burden, you hear me? You're here because I invited you, because it's the right thing to do. But you didn't want us. You wanted Aunt Sarah. The truth of it hung in the air like gun smoke. Jonah could have lied, could have offered easy comfort, but Eli was too smart for that, had seen too much to believe comfortable fictions. You're right, he said instead. I didn't expect you, but that doesn't mean I don't want you here now. Eli searched his face, looking for the lie. Really? Really? You're a good worker, Eli, and your sisters and brother, they're good kids. Your ma's doing her best in a bad situation. That's nothing to be ashamed of. People in town looked at us like we were beggars. People in town will always find something to talk about. Doesn't mean they're right. Jonah stood, brushed dirt from his knees. Come on, let's get this fence finished. They worked until noon when Mara appeared with sandwiches and water, June toddling beside her carrying a blanket. They ate in the shade of a cottonwood tree, the children sprawling in the grass, finally relaxing enough to just be young. They're good helpers, Jonah told Mara, watching Eli show Thomas how to make a whistle from a blade of grass. They're desperate to be useful, Mara said quietly. They've been that way since James died, like they have to justify their existence. They're children. They don't have to justify anything. Tell them that. She sighed, adjusting the sleeping baby in her arms. I try. But when you've been hungry, when you've had landlords shouting at you because the rent's late, when you've had to beg for scraps, it changes you. Even children. But Jonah thought about the war, about the things he'd seen that had changed him down to his bones. They're resilient, he said. They'll bounce back. I hope so. Mara looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw the question in her eyes, the one she was too proud or too afraid to ask out loud. Why are you doing this? What do you want from us? He didn't have a good answer, didn't fully understand it himself. Part duty, part loneliness, part something deeper that he couldn't name. The sense that maybe Sarah had been right about him after all. That maybe he was the kind of man who could help bear someone else's burden. Or maybe he was just a fool who'd let a pretty face and desperate eyes override common sense. The days blurred together after that, falling into a rhythm that was both strange and oddly comfortable. Jonah would wake before dawn in the hayloft, find Mara already up with the baby, drink bitter coffee in companionable silence before heading out to the stock. Eli would join him after breakfast, eager to learn, with Clara often tagging along. Thomas helped his mother with the little ones, fetching and carrying with serious concentration. June followed whoever would let her, chattering constantly in the way of 4-year-olds. Mara transformed the house. Not with money, they had none, but with effort and creativity. She scrubbed floors until they gleamed, mended curtains Jonah hadn't realized were torn, organized his chaotic pantry into something approaching order. She cooked meals that made the house smell like a home instead of just a shelter. She sang while she worked, soft songs that drifted out through the windows. The children grew louder, more confident. Clara's laughter rang out more frequently. Thomas took his thumb out of his mouth. Even Eli's shoulders began to lose some of their tension, though he still watched Jonah with the wary intensity of someone expecting the other shoe to drop. It should have felt like an invasion. His space, his routine, his carefully constructed solitude all shattered. But somehow it didn't. Somehow the noise and chaos felt like something that had been missing, a void he hadn't known existed until it was filled. On the 5th day, Jonah rode into town for supplies. The general store went quiet when he walked in, conversations cutting off mid-sentence. Chester Polk was there, along with Widow Hutchins and a handful of others. Jonah, Chester nodded slowly. Heard you took in that widow and her youngsters. That's right. Mighty Christian of you. The words were polite, but the tone carried a weight of judgment that made Jonah's jaw tighten. Needed help on the ranch, he said flatly. They needed a place to stay. Seemed practical. Practical. Widow Hutchins sniffed. That what we're calling it? What would you call it, ma'am? I'd call it inviting scandal right into your home. She drew herself up, righteous indignation radiating from her like heat. A widower and a widow, unmarried, living under the same roof with all those children? It's not decent, Jonah Mercer. It's not proper. I'm sleeping in the barn. That's not the point, and you know it. People talk. They see that woman and wonder what kind of arrangement you've made. They see those children and wonder if maybe some of them aren't as fatherless as claimed. Rage flashed hot through Jonah's veins. You suggesting what I think you're suggesting? I'm suggesting you think about appearances, about reputation. I'm thinking about 5 hungry children who had nowhere to go. He stepped closer, letting her see the anger in his face. I'm thinking about doing what's right instead of what's convenient. Maybe you should try it sometime. He bought his supplies in hostile silence, paid, and left. The whole ride back to the ranch, his anger simmered. Not at Widow Hutchins. She was just a small-minded busybody saying what small-minded busybodies always said. But at the injustice of it, the casual cruelty of judging a desperate woman and her children. When he got back, he found Mara hanging laundry, the baby asleep in a basket at her feet. She looked up as he approached, and her smile died when she saw his expression. What happened? He didn't want to tell her, didn't want to add to her burdens, but she had a right to know what people were saying. Town's talking, he said, climbing down from the wagon. About us. About the arrangement. Mara's face went pale. I see. Widow Hutchins thinks we're... He couldn't even say it. She's implying things that aren't true. Of course she is. Mara's voice was flat, lifeless. I knew this would happen. I told you, we're a burden. We're ruining your reputation. My reputation can handle it. But mine can't. And the children? She pressed her hands to her face. God, the children. If people start saying things, if they decide they're wrong. That doesn't matter. She dropped her hands, and he saw tears tracking down her cheeks. Right and wrong don't matter when it comes to gossip. People believe what they want to believe, and a widower and a widow living together without marriage? They'll make it into something ugly no matter what the truth is. Jonah knew she was right. Knew that in a town like Redemption Springs, reputation was currency, and Mara's was already tarnished by poverty and desperation. Adding scandal to it would destroy whatever chance she had of building a life here. So what do you want to do? He asked quietly. Mara was silent for a long moment, staring at the laundry flapping in the wind. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know. I can't leave. We have nowhere to go. But I can't stay and watch people whisper about us. Watch them look at my children like they're... She choked on a sob. I don't know what to do. The baby woke up crying. Mara bent to pick her up, but her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the child. Jonah stepped in, taking Rose gently and passing her to her mother. We'll figure it out, he said, with more confidence than he felt. But that night, lying in the hayloft, staring at the stars through gaps in the roof, he couldn't see a way forward that didn't hurt someone. If Mara stayed, she'd be branded as his mistress, her children as bastards in the making. If she left, she'd starve, simple as that. There was a third option, one that had been scratching at the back of his mind since Widow Hutchins had planted the seed. But it was insane. It was taking charity to a level that went beyond reasonable, beyond sane. He could marry her. The thought sat in his chest like a stone. Marriage, real, legal marriage, would solve the reputation problem instantly, would give Mara and the children security, a name, protection from gossip, would give him... What would it give him? Not what he'd wanted with Sarah, not the quiet partnership of 2 people choosing each other, but maybe something practical, something that served a purpose even if it wasn't romantic. He thought about it for 3 more days, watching Mara work herself to exhaustion trying to be useful, watching the children start to believe they might be safe here, only to see that hope waver every time someone mentioned town, watching his own life become something he barely recognized but somehow didn't want to lose. On the 8th day, he found Mara in the garden she'd started, pulling weeds with vicious efficiency. The baby was asleep under a makeshift shade, and the children were down by the creek, their laughter carrying on the wind. Mara. She looked up, wiping sweat from her forehead. Is something wrong? Need to talk to you about something. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her skirt. There was a smudge of mud on her cheek, and her hair was falling out of its bun, and she looked exhausted and beautiful and so far from the life she should have had. "All right," she said warily. Jonah hadn't prepared a speech, hadn't figured out how to make this sound like anything other than the desperate solution it was. So he just said it straight. "We should get married." Mara stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "What?" "Married. You and me. Would solve the reputation problem. Give the children a father's name. Make this—" He gestured vaguely at the ranch. "Make this legitimate." "Jonah, you can't. You don't." She was shaking her head, backing away. "You don't want to marry me. You wanted Sarah. You wanted a quiet life with someone who— I'm not her. I come with 5 children and more problems than you can count, and I know what you come with." "Then you know this is insane." Her voice rose, edged with hysteria. "You're offering to marry a stranger out of pity, out of, I don't know, some misplaced sense of obligation to my dead sister. That's not a basis for a marriage. Neither is love sometimes. People marry for practical reasons all the time. And are they happy?" Jonah thought about his parents' marriage. His father grim and silent, his mother worn down by hardship and disappointment. Thought about the marriages he'd seen in town, some loving, some merely functional, some outright hostile. "Happiness is overrated," he said. "Survival matters more." "Not to me." Mara's eyes were blazing now, all that exhaustion burned away by anger. "I won't trap you in a marriage you don't want. I won't be the burden you resent for the rest of your life. I'd rather—" Her voice broke. "I'd rather take my children and starve than watch you grow to hate us." "I wouldn't hate you. You say that now. But 5 years from now, when you're still stuck with children that aren't yours, with a wife you never chose, with a life you never wanted, you'll hate us. And they'll know it. Children always know." She was crying now, harsh sobs that shook her whole body. Jonah wanted to reach for her, to offer comfort, but he didn't know if he had that right. "I'm trying to help," he said quietly. "I know, and I'm grateful, but I can't." She wiped fiercely at her tears. "I married for love the first time. James was kind and good, and we built something real together, and when I lost him, I thought I'd never have that again. I made my peace with that, but I won't settle for a marriage of convenience. I won't do that to you or to myself." "What if it's not convenient?" Jonah said. "What if it's just necessary?" "Necessity isn't enough." They stood in the garden, the sun beating down, the baby sleeping peacefully and unaware of the adult catastrophe unfolding around her. Jonah felt something cracking in his chest, some wall he'd built that was finally giving way. "I'm not good at this," he said roughly. "Not good at talking about feelings, things that matter. I spent too long alone, and before that I spent too long at war, and I don't know how to—" He stopped, frustrated. "I'm not offering out of pity, Mara. I'm offering because in 8 days you've made this place feel more like a home than it has in the 3 years I've lived here. Because watching Eli learn to handle the horses makes me feel something I thought the war killed. Because your kids are good kids, and they deserve a father who gives a damn. But you don't love me." "No," he admitted. "But I could. Maybe. If you gave me time." Mara looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for what? Truth? Lies? Some sign that this wasn't the disaster it appeared to be? "I need to think," she said finally. "This isn't— I can't just— I need time." "Take all the time you need." But even as he said it, they both knew time was a luxury they didn't have. Every day that passed was another day of rumors building, another day of Mara's fragile position becoming more precarious. That night at supper, the children were unusually quiet, picking at their food. Finally, Eli spoke up, his voice small. "Are we leaving?" Mara's fork clattered to her plate. "What? No. Why would you think that? I heard you crying this afternoon, and you and Mr. Mercer, you were talking about—" He stopped, suddenly looking very young despite his attempts at maturity. "Did we do something wrong?" "No, baby, no." Mara reached across the table, gripped his hand. "You didn't do anything wrong." "Then why were you crying?" "Because—" She looked helplessly at Jonah, then back at her son. "Because grown-up things are complicated sometimes. But we're not leaving, I promise." but Eli was too smart to be fooled by easy reassurances. You promised we'd be safe. You promised we'd have a home. And you will. How? The word was almost a shout. How, Ma? We don't have money. We don't have anywhere else to go. And if the town decides if they say things about you and Mr. Mercer, what then? Where do we go then? The silence that followed was crushing. Clara was crying quietly. Thomas had his thumb back in his mouth. Even June looked scared, her little face crumpling. Jonah watched Mara's face crumble, watched her try to hold herself together for her children and fail. Watched her open her mouth to offer more promises she couldn't keep. Your Ma and I are getting married, he heard himself say. Every head swiveled toward him. Mara's eyes went wide with shock. What? Eli whispered. Getting married, Jonah repeated, his voice steady even as his heart hammered. That's what we were discussing. How to make this arrangement permanent, legal. Jonah, Mara started, but he kept talking. Makes sense when you think about it. You need security. I need help on the ranch. Marriage solves both problems. You want to marry Ma? Clara asked, her voice full of wonder and hope that made Jonah's chest ache. Yes. And be our pa? The question hung in the air. Jonah looked at these 5 children, these strangers who'd crashed into his life and upended everything, and felt that crack in his chest widen into something that might have been tenderness. Yes, he said simply. June shrieked with joy and launched herself at him, wrapping her small arms around his leg. Thomas followed, then Clara, all of them piling on with desperate affection. Even Eli, more restrained, came over and offered his hand to shake, man to man. Over their heads, Jonah met Mara's eyes. She was crying again, but differently now, not with despair, but with something that might have been relief or gratitude or fear, or all 3 at once. Later, after the children were in bed, she found him outside staring at the stars. You shouldn't have done that, she said quietly. Had to. They needed to hear it. But now we're trapped. You just promised 5 children that you'd be their father. You can't take that back. Don't want to. Mara was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. This isn't what you wanted. No, Jonah agreed. But sometimes what we get is better than what we wanted. Just takes a while to see it. She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the soap she'd used to wash her hair, could see the exhaustion and hope warring in her face. If we do this, she said slowly, if we really do this, I need you to promise me something. What? Promise me you'll tell me. If you regret it, if you start to resent us, promise me you won't just suffer in silence and let it poison everything. I promise. And promise me, her voice wavered, promise me you'll try to be their father, not just in name, but in truth. They've lost so much already. I won't let them lose another father. I'll try, Jonah said, and meant it. Mara nodded once, then turned and went back inside, leaving him alone with the stars and the enormity of what he'd just agreed to. Somewhere in the house, a child laughed in their sleep. The cattle lowed softly in the near pasture. The night wind carried the scent of sage and possibility. Jonah had asked for a wife and gotten a family, had planned for quiet and gotten chaos, had expected nothing and received everything. Whether it would be enough, whether he would be enough, remained to be seen. But standing there under the vast New Mexico sky, listening to his house full of other people's children, Jonah found he was willing to find out. They were married 3 days later in the front room of the ranch house, with only the children as witnesses and a circuit preacher who asked no questions about the arrangement. Mara wore the same travel-stained dress she'd arrived in, though she'd washed and mended it as best she could. Jonah wore his good shirt again, the one without patches, and felt his collar choking him through the entire brief ceremony. Do you, Jonah Mercer, take this woman? I do. And do you, Mara Ellison, take this man? I do. Her voice was steady, but her hand trembled in his. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. That was it. No kiss, no celebration, just a piece of paper signed and witnessed, and a new name for Mara to carry. The children clapped and cheered like it was a real wedding, like their mother hadn't just married a stranger out of desperation, and their new father hadn't just trapped himself in a life he never asked for. The preacher left with his payment, more than Jonah could afford, but less than the man probably deserved for riding out to the middle of nowhere on short notice. When the dust from his wagon settled, Jonah found himself standing in his own house as a married man, with a wife who wouldn't meet his eyes and 5 children who were looking at him like he'd just promised them the moon. "Well," Mara said into the awkward silence, "I should start supper." She fled to the kitchen, and Jonah was left with the children clustering around him, June tugging on his hand. "Are you really our pa now?" she asked. Jonah looked down at her upturned face, at the hope shining there like something fragile and precious. "Yes." "Can I call you Pa?" The word stuck in his throat. Pa. Father. Terms he'd never expected to claim, never thought he'd deserve after everything the war had taken from him. "If you want to," he managed. June threw her arms around his legs again, and this time Jonah let himself put a hand on her small head, feeling the softness of her hair. One by one, the other children approached. Thomas shy and uncertain, Clara with tears streaming down her face, Eli hanging back until last, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to call me anything you're not comfortable with," Jonah told him quietly. Eli studied him for a long moment. "My pa. My real pa. He was a good man. I know. I don't want to forget him." "You shouldn't. A man like that deserves to be remembered." Something in Eli's face cracked open then, the careful control he'd been maintaining for so long finally breaking. "But I don't remember what he looked like anymore. I try and I can't. I can't see his face." Jonah pulled the boy against his chest, feeling him shake with sobs he'd probably been holding back for 14 months. The other children piled on, all of them crying now, and Jonah stood there in the middle of his front room, holding 5 grieving children and wondering what in God's name he'd gotten himself into. From the kitchen, he heard the clatter of pots and the sound of Mara crying quietly, trying to muffle it so the children wouldn't hear. That night, after the children were asleep and the house had fallen into an uneasy quiet, Jonah found Mara sitting outside on the porch step, staring at the stars. He'd been heading to the barn, to his usual sleeping place, but something made him stop. "Cold out here," he said. "I needed air." She didn't look at him. "The house feels smaller, somehow, now that it's official." Jonah sat down beside her, leaving a careful space between them. "Having regrets already?" "No, yes. I don't know." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I keep thinking about James, about how I stood in front of a preacher with him and meant every word, how I loved him so much it scared me sometimes. And today I stood there and said the same words to you, and I felt nothing. Just relief that we were safe. Is that terrible? It's honest. I feel like I betrayed him, like I cheapened what we had by..." She gestured helplessly. "By doing this. You did what you had to do to protect your children. Your husband would understand that." "Would he?" Mara's voice broke. "Or would he be ashamed that I couldn't manage on my own, that I had to throw myself at the first man who'd take us?" "You didn't throw yourself at anyone. I offered. Because you felt sorry for us." "No." Jonah said it firmly enough that she finally looked at him. "Not sorry. I offered because those kids deserve better than what the world's given them, and because you're stronger than you think you are, and because..." He stopped, searching for words that wouldn't sound stupid or presumptuous. "Because when I woke up this morning, I heard your kids laughing, and it was the first time in 3 years this place felt like something worth fighting for." Mara stared at him, tears tracking silver down her cheeks in the moonlight. "I don't know how to be married to you." "I don't know how to be married to you either. Guess we'll figure it out as we go. And if we can't, if this was a mistake, then we deal with it. But those kids in there, they believe in this now. They believe they're safe, that they have a father who won't disappear. We owe it to them to make it work. Even if it makes us miserable?" Jonah thought about that, about the years he'd spent alone, about the silence that had eaten at him like rot, about the past 10 days of noise and chaos and finding himself teaching Eli to ride, or listening to Clara chatter about flowers, or having June fall asleep against his shoulder after supper. "Don't think it'll make us miserable," he said quietly. Different, yes, but not miserable. Mara was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "Where are you sleeping tonight?" "Barn, same as always." "Jonah, we're married now. People will expect—" "I don't care what people expect." He stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "You need time. So do I. When you're ready for something different, you let me know. Until then, barn's fine." He left her sitting there and made his way across the dark yard. Behind him, he heard her whisper something that might have been thank you or might have been the wind. The spring storms came early that year, rolling across the high desert like God's own fury. Jonah had seen the signs for days, the cattle restless, the horses skittish, the clouds building on the western horizon like mountains made of darkness. He'd spent the week preparing, checking the barn roof, securing anything that could blow away, making sure the stock had access to high ground. But when the storm finally hit, it was worse than anything he'd anticipated. It started in the afternoon with wind that bent the cottonwood trees nearly double. Then rain, sheets of it so thick Jonah couldn't see the barn from the house. Thunder cracked like artillery, and June screamed and buried her face in Mara's skirts. The baby wailed. Even Clara and Thomas looked frightened, huddled together at the window watching the world turn to water. "It's all right," Mara said, her voice steady despite her own fear. "The house is solid. We're safe." But Jonah was staring out at his cattle, at the way the near pasture was already flooding, water rising with terrifying speed. The creek had burst its banks, turning from a gentle stream into a raging torrent that was spreading across the lowlands. "I have to get the cattle to higher ground," he said. "Jonah, no, it's too dangerous. They'll drown if I don't." He was already pulling on his oilskin coat, his boots. "Keep the children inside. Don't let them come out no matter what." "Jonah!" But he was already out the door, leaning into wind that tried to shove him back. The rain was cold as ice, soaking through his clothes in seconds. He could barely see, barely hear over the roar of the storm. The cattle were bunched in the corner of the pasture, lowing in terror as the water rose around their legs. Jonah waded in, the current trying to sweep his feet out from under him, shouting and waving his arms to drive them toward the slope that led to higher ground. They moved sluggishly, stupid with fear. One cow stumbled and went down, and Jonah had to grab her by the horns and haul her upright before the water swept her away. His hands were numb, his whole body shaking with cold and effort. He didn't hear Eli coming until the boy was beside him, also soaked to the skin, eyes wide with terror but jaw set with determination. "What are you doing?" Jonah shouted over the storm. "Get back to the house! You need help! Eli, go back! No!" The boy grabbed a stick and started driving cattle the way he'd seen Jonah do it, his small body braced against the wind. "I'm helping!" There was no time to argue. Together they drove the herd toward safety, Jonah's heart in his throat every time Eli slipped or stumbled. The water was waist-deep now on the boy, tugging at him with fingers that wanted to pull him under. They were almost there, almost to the high ground, when Eli's foot caught on something submerged. He went down hard, disappearing under the churning water. Jonah lunged for him, felt his hand close on the boy's collar, and hauled him up gasping and choking. But the current had them both now. It swept them away from the cattle, away from the slope, toward the creek that had become a river. Jonah's boots filled with water, weighing him down. Eli was screaming, clinging to him with desperate strength. Jonah grabbed for anything, a branch, a rock, anything to stop their slide toward death. His hand closed on a root jutting from the bank, and he held on with strength born of pure desperation. The water tried to tear them loose, tried to suck them under, but Jonah held on. "Climb," he shouted at Eli. "Use me as a ladder and climb." The boy was crying, terrified, but he obeyed. He scrambled up Jonah's body, using him like a rope, and caught hold of the root, pulled himself up onto the bank, and then reached down, small hands grabbing for Jonah. "I can't. You're too heavy." "Don't let go of that root," Jonah ordered. "Hold on, and I'll pull myself up." It took everything he had. His muscles screamed, his hands were torn and bleeding from the rough wood, but inch by inch he hauled himself out of the killing water and onto the muddy bank. They lay there gasping, the rain still hammering down, alive by inches. "You stupid, stupid boy," Jonah gasped out. "What were you thinking? You needed help," Eli sobbed. "I needed you safe. Your mom... If something had happened to you..." He couldn't finish the thought. Couldn't imagine facing Mara if he'd gotten her son killed. They stumbled back to the house together, supporting each other, the cattle forgotten for now. Mara met them at the door, her face white as death. And when she saw them both alive, she made a sound somewhere between a sob and a scream. "He went out after you," she said, her hands running over Eli, checking for injuries with frantic efficiency. "I tried to stop him, but he ran out and I couldn't." She looked at Jonah then, and he saw murder in her eyes. "You could have been killed. Both of you could have died." "The cattle? Damn the cattle!" She was shaking, whether with fear or rage he couldn't tell. "Do you think I care about cattle when my son is out there in a flood?" "Ma," Eli tried. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare defend this. You could have drowned. You could have—" Her voice broke completely, and she pulled Eli against her, holding him so tight he squeaked in protest. Jonah stood there, dripping on the floor, watching his wife, strange to even think it, falling apart. The other children were crying now, scared by their mother's terror. Baby Rose was screaming. The whole house was chaos and fear. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Mara looked at him over Eli's head. "You don't get to die," she said fiercely. "You hear me? You don't get to make me a widow twice. You don't get to make these children lose another father. You made a promise, Jonah Mercer. You promised to be here." "I know." "Do you? Do you really?" Tears were streaming down her face. "When I saw him run out that door, when I realized you were both out there, I thought I was going to lose everything, again, and I can't—" She choked on the words. "I can't survive that again. I can't." Jonah wanted to go to her, to offer comfort, but he was still dripping and muddy and wasn't sure he had the right. They'd been married less than a week. They were still strangers in all the ways that mattered. But then Clara grabbed his hand and Thomas wrapped his arms around his legs, and June was crying, "Pa, Pa, you're okay." And he realized that maybe he wasn't a stranger to all of them anymore. "Get out of those wet clothes," Mara said, her voice rough. "Both of you, before you catch your death." She turned away, busying herself with the baby, but her hands were shaking. Jonah changed in the supply room, finding dry clothes with numb fingers. Eli emerged from the main bedroom in an old shirt of Jonah's that hung on him like a dress, and despite everything, Jonah felt his mouth twitch toward a smile. The storm raged through the night. They huddled together in the main room, the children eventually falling asleep in a pile of blankets by the fire. Mara sat in the rocking chair with Rose, staring at the flames, her face still pale and drawn. "I meant what I said," she said into the quiet. "About losing you. I know. I can't love you yet. It's too soon, and James is still too close. But I need you. The children need you. And if you throw your life away for a few head of cattle, it won't happen again. Promise me." Jonah looked at the sleeping children, at this family he'd somehow acquired. Thought about Eli's small hands trying to pull him from the water, about the boy's willingness to risk everything to help. "I promise," he said. "No more risks like that." Mara nodded, rocking slowly. The baby's breathing evened out into sleep. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the thunder moving off into the distance. "He called you Pa," Mara said softly. "In the water, when he was scared, he called for Pa." Jonah's throat tightened. "Did he?" He doesn't remember his father's face anymore, but he's trying so hard to hold on to him, to keep that memory sacred. She looked at Jonah then, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "And now you're here, and he wants to love you, but he's afraid it means betraying James. They all are. And you?" "I don't know what I am." She turned back to the fire. Grateful, terrified, confused, all of it at once. They sat in silence as the storm died, and the first light of dawn began to gray the windows. When Jonah finally went to check the damage, he found the cattle safe on high ground, the barn intact despite some missing shingles, and the pasture turned to a muddy lake that would take days to drain. It could have been so much worse. They could have lost everything. He could have lost Eli, could have left Mara a widow again after a week of marriage. The near miss of it sat in his chest like a stone. Over the following days, something shifted. The children had always been polite, grateful, carefully obedient. But now they started to relax, to push boundaries the way children do when they feel secure enough to test limits. Thomas tracked mud through the house and forgot to feel guilty about it. Clara asked for seconds at dinner without apologizing. June demanded stories at bedtime in the imperious way of 4-year-olds who know they're loved. And Eli started calling him Pa without the hesitation, without the guilt. Started seeking him out to learn, to talk, to just exist in the same space with the comfortable silence of family. Mara watched it all with an expression Jonah couldn't quite read. Not unhappy, but not entirely at peace either. She still kept a careful distance from him, still treated their marriage like a business arrangement rather than anything approaching affection. But she stopped flinching when he came close, stopped apologizing for every small thing, started asking his opinion on household matters like his input actually mattered to her. It wasn't love, but it was something. The first fragile threads of trust, maybe, of partnership. 2 weeks after the storm, Jonah rode to town for supplies. The gossip had reached a fever pitch. He could tell by the way conversation stopped when he walked into the general store, by the sidelong glances and whispered comments. "Heard you married that widow," Chester Polk said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That was quick work, even for you." "Had reasons," Jonah said flatly. "I'm sure you did." Chester's tone made it clear what he thought those reasons were. Widow Hutchins appeared at his elbow, radiating disapproval like a physical force. "People are saying things, Jonah, saying you took advantage of that poor woman's desperation, saying those children aren't being properly raised in such a situation." "Those children are being fed and clothed and educated," Jonah said, keeping his voice level with effort. "They have a roof over their heads and adults who care about them. What more do people want? Propriety? Decency? The appearance of moral... The appearance." He turned on her, letting her see his anger. "My wife and I are legally married. Those children call me Pa. We're a family in every way that matters. If people want to make something ugly out of that, that's their problem, not mine." He bought his supplies and left, but the encounter sat heavy on him the whole ride home. The town would never accept them, he realized, would always see Mara as a gold digger and him as a fool, and the children as unfortunate pawns in whatever sordid drama they'd invented. But when he got back to the ranch, he found Eli teaching Thomas how to groom the horses, their voices carrying through the barn door. Clara was helping Mara hang laundry, chattering about a bird's nest she'd found. June was sitting in a patch of sun with baby Rose, singing to her in a surprisingly sweet voice. It looked like a home, felt like one. Let the town talk. This messy, complicated, unexpected thing they were building was real in ways that mattered more than reputation. That night at supper, Eli cleared his throat importantly. "Pa?" Jonah looked up from his stew. "Yes?" "I've been thinking about the cattle and about what happened in the storm." "What about it?" "We need a better system for getting them to high ground when the weather turns bad." The boy's face was earnest, thoughtful. "Maybe we could build a shelter on the rise, something with a roof so they'd naturally go there for shade, and then when a storm comes, they're already halfway to safety." It was a good idea, a smart idea. Jonah felt pride swell in his chest, unfamiliar and startling. "That's solid thinking," he said. "We could do that. Maybe start building next week if the ground dries out enough." Eli's face lit up like Jonah had given him gold. Across the table, Mara was watching them with an expression that made Jonah's breath catch. Not quite a smile, but close. Something soft and wondering, like she was seeing something she hadn't expected to find. Later, after the children were in bed, she found him on the porch again. Their spot, it had become without either of them discussing it. The place where they could talk without the children hearing, where the careful walls they maintained during the day could come down just a little. "Thank you," she said, settling beside him. "For what?" "For listening to Eli, for taking his idea seriously. His father used to—" She stopped, swallowed. "James used to brush him off sometimes, said he was too young to understand how things worked. But you listened. He had a good idea. Why wouldn't I listen? Most men wouldn't. Most men would see him as a burden, another mouth to feed. But you treat him like he matters. He does matter." Mara turned to look at him fully, and in the moonlight her face was unguarded in a way it never was during the day. "When I said yes to marrying you, I thought it would be a cold arrangement, practical and distant. I thought you'd tolerate the children and resent me, and we'd all just survive in the same space without actually being a family. And now? Now I don't know what to think." Her voice was almost a whisper. "Because you're not tolerating them. You're being their father, teaching them, protecting them, listening to them. And I didn't expect that. Didn't think it was possible after only 2 weeks." 3 weeks, Jonah corrected without thinking. That startled a laugh out of her, the first real laugh he'd heard from her. 3 weeks, she agreed. "And in that time you've become more of a father to them than—" She stopped, shook her head. "I shouldn't compare. James was a good man. You said so." "He was, but he struggled near the end with work, with providing. The pressure of it broke something in him. He started drinking, started taking risks he shouldn't have taken. That's why he was driving that wagon on a mountain pass in bad weather. He took a job no sane teamster would take because we needed the money." Her voice cracked. "He died trying to provide for us, and I can't decide if that makes him noble or foolish." "Maybe both," Jonah said quietly. "Maybe." Mara wiped at her eyes. "But you're steady. You think before you act. Even with the storm, even with nearly dying, you came back and you didn't run. You didn't decide we were too much trouble. Where would I run to? Anywhere. You could pack up and leave tomorrow, and we'd have no legal claim on you except a piece of paper. You could decide this was a mistake and walk away. Is that what you're afraid of? That I'll leave? Isn't that what everyone does eventually?" She said it like a fact, like something proven by experience. People leave. They die, or they give up, or they just disappear. I can't let myself believe you're different, because if I do, and you prove me wrong, I'm not leaving. You say that now. I'll say it next month too, next year, 10 years from now. Jonah turned to face her, making sure she could see his face in the moonlight. "I made a promise. To you, to those kids. I don't break my promises." Mara stared at him, something vulnerable and desperate in her expression. "I want to believe you." "Then believe me." "It's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because—" She stopped, frustrated. "Because believing in people, trusting them, that's how you get hurt. That's how you end up alone with 5 children and no way forward." "You're not alone anymore." "Aren't I?" She stood abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself. "We sleep in different rooms, Jonah. We barely touch. We're married, but we're strangers. How is that not alone?" The truth of it hung between them like a blade. Jonah stood too, uncertain, knowing they were on the edge of something, but not sure if he should push forward or pull back. "What do you want?" he asked. "I don't know." Mara's voice was raw. "I don't know what I want or what I feel, or how to be married to someone I barely know. I don't know how to—" She stopped, turned away. "Never mind. I'm tired. I should check on Rose." She fled before he could respond, leaving him alone on the porch with the sense that something important had just slipped through his fingers. The distance between them felt wider after that night, not smaller. Mara threw herself into work with renewed intensity, scrubbing and cooking and mending like her life depended on staying busy. She was unfailingly polite, always grateful, but there was a wall up that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, and Jonah was only just now seeing it clearly. The children noticed. Eli watched them both with worried eyes. Claire asked if Ma was sick. Even June seemed more clingy, more anxious. "Did we do something wrong?" Eli asked Jonah one afternoon while they were mending fence. "No. Why would you think that?" "Ma's been crying. I heard her last night, after we were supposed to be asleep." Jonah's hands stilled on the wire. "She's just adjusting. It's a big change for all of us." "Is she sad she married you?" The question hit like a fist to the gut. "I don't know, Eli. Maybe." "Are you sad you married her?" Jonah thought about that, about the chaos and noise, the constant demands on his time and attention, the way his orderly life had been completely upended, about Mara's tears and the children's needs, and the weight of responsibility he'd never asked for. "No," he said honestly. "I'm not sad." Eli processed this, his young face serious. "Pa? Yes? I'm glad you married Ma, even if she's sad sometimes. I'm glad we're here." Jonah pulled the boy against his side in a brief, awkward embrace. "Me too, son." But that night, lying in the hayloft staring at the stars through the roof gaps, Jonah wondered if being glad was enough. If not regretting a decision was the same as making the right one. And in the house, Mara lay awake listening to Rose breathe, wondering the exact same thing. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning 6 weeks after the wedding, when Jonah made his monthly trip to town and returned to find Mara packing. Not everything, just a single carpet bag sitting open on the bed she shared with the girls, a few items of clothing folded inside. She froze when she heard his boots on the floor, guilt written across her face like a confession. "What's this?" His voice came out flat, carefully controlled. She stopped, started again. "I heard something, in town, yesterday when I took the eggs to sell." Jonah waited, dread pooling in his stomach. "Widow Hutchins cornered me outside the general store." Mara's hands twisted together, her knuckles white. She said people are talking, saying terrible things about us, about the children. She said Clara shouldn't be allowed in the schoolhouse anymore because it's not proper, having a child from such a situation mixing with decent children. "Clara loves school." "I know." Mara's voice broke. "But Widow Hutchins said if we don't want the children completely ostracized, if we don't want them branded as bastards and worse, then maybe it would be better if we left. Found somewhere where people don't know our story." Jonah stared at the carpet bag, at this woman who'd somehow become his wife, preparing to run again. Always running, always one step ahead of judgment and poverty and the next disaster. "So you were going to leave," he said quietly, without even talking to me first. "I was going to tell you. I needed to think it through first." "Think what through? How to abandon the first stable home those kids have had in over a year? How to break Eli's heart after he's finally starting to feel safe? I'm trying to protect them." Mara's voice rose, sharp with desperation. "Don't you understand? If we stay here, they'll be marked forever. They'll grow up being whispered about, excluded, treated like they're less than. I won't do that to them." "So you'll drag them to another town where you have no money, no home, no prospects? And what happens when people start talking there too? You run again?" "If I have to, yes." "That's not protecting them, Mara. That's teaching them that they should be ashamed, that they should run from gossip instead of standing firm." She turned on him then, eyes blazing. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one they're calling names. You're not the one whose children are being excluded because their mother is—" She choked on the word. "Their mother is what? A widow who married for security? That's not shameful. That's survival." "The town doesn't see it that way. The town can go to hell." Jonah crossed to the bed, pulled the clothes out of the carpet bag, and tossed them aside. "You're not leaving. You can't tell me what to do. I'm your husband. Those are my children now, too, legally. And I'm telling you, we don't run from this." Mara's face crumpled. "I don't know how to fight it. I don't know how to make them stop. We stop caring what they think. We build our life here and we don't let their poison touch it. But Clara stays in school. Let Widow Hutchins try to remove her. I'll go to the school board myself if I have to." "Jonah, you don't understand the power of gossip, how it spreads, how it destroys." "I understand plenty." He caught her shoulders, made her look at him. "I understand that you've been running and hiding and trying to make yourself small for so long you've forgotten how to stand up straight. But I'm not running, and neither are you." "Why?" The question came out as almost a wail. "Why does it matter to you so much? They're not your children. We're not really a family. We're just people sharing a house." The words hit harder than she probably intended. Jonah dropped his hands, stepped back. "That's what you think?" His voice was quiet now, almost dangerous. "After 6 weeks of watching me teach Eli to ride, of seeing me rock Rose to sleep when she's fussy, of Clara calling me Pa and meaning it, you think we're just people sharing a house?" I don't know what we are. Mara was crying now, harsh sobs that shook her whole frame. I don't know how to do this, how to be married to someone I don't love, how to watch my children love you when I'm still in love with a dead man, Jonah finished. I know. That's not fair. Maybe not. But it's true. He moved to the window, stared out at the yard where Thomas and June were playing some elaborate game involving sticks and a lot of running. You want to know what I think? I think you're terrified. Not of the gossip, not really. You're terrified that if you let yourself build something here, if you let yourself believe we're safe, it'll all get ripped away again. So you're looking for an excuse to run before that can happen. Mara made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Jonah turned to face her. You love James. You built a life with him, had children with him, and then he died and took that whole life with him. You learned that nothing is permanent, nothing is safe. So now you can't let yourself believe in anything or anyone because believing means risking that kind of loss again. Stop it. And you're teaching those kids the same thing, teaching them that home is temporary, that people always leave, that they should never get comfortable anywhere because it won't last. Stop! Mara's voice cracked like a whip. You think you understand? You think you know what it's like to watch someone you love die? To be left alone with 5 children and no way to feed them? To have to beg and scrape and humiliate yourself just to keep them alive? No, Jonah said quietly. I don't know what that's like. But I know what it's like to lose everyone you love in one night. I know what it's like to come home from war and find your whole family dead from fever. I know what it's like to build a life from nothing because there's nothing left of the old one to go back to. Mara went still, shock replacing anger on her face. Your family died while I was at Shiloh. Ma, Pa, 2 sisters. The neighbors buried them before I even got the letter. The words came out mechanical, a story told so many times it had lost its edges. I came back to Tennessee and there was nothing there for me. So I came west and built this. He gestured at the house around them. Built it alone because I was too scared to need anyone ever again. Jonah? So don't tell me I don't understand loss. Don't tell me I don't know what it's like to be afraid of letting people in. He crossed back to her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. The difference between us is I'm trying. I'm trying to build something new even though it terrifies me. But you're still running. They stood there in the charged silence, Mara's tears drying on her cheeks, both of them breathing hard like they'd been fighting physically, instead of just with words. I don't know how to stop, she whispered finally. Then let me help you. How? Jonah reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling. We start by unpacking that bag, by deciding that this is home, whatever the town says, by standing together instead of you trying to carry everything alone. But what if it doesn't work? What if we can't? Then we'll deal with it, together. He squeezed her hand gently. But we have to try, Mara, for the kids if nothing else. They need to see adults who don't give up when things get hard. Mara stared at their joined hands like she couldn't quite believe they were connected. Then, slowly she nodded. All right, we'll stay. And no more packing bags without talking to me first. That pulled a watery laugh from her. Deal. The moment stretched between them, fragile and important. Jonah wanted to pull her closer, to offer more comfort, but he wasn't sure if he had that right yet. They were married, but not really. Committed, but not really. Building something, but neither of them knew what. A crash from outside shattered the moment. They both rushed to the window to see Eli sprawled in the dirt, the fence he'd apparently been climbing still swaying, and June standing over him looking guilty. I told him he couldn't climb it, June announced as they ran outside, but he didn't listen. I'm fine, Eli wheezed, struggling to catch his breath. Just fell wrong. Jonah helped him up, checking for injuries with hands that had grown practiced at this over the past weeks. Anything broken? Just my pride. Eli managed a shaky grin. And maybe your common sense, Mara said, her voice sharp with the kind of fear that came out as anger. What were you thinking? I wanted to see if I could reach the top. Well, you can't, and now you're bruised, and Eli, you scared me half to death. The boy looked genuinely contrite. "Sorry, Ma." She pulled him into a fierce hug, and over his head her eyes met Jonah's. Something passed between them, an understanding, maybe. A recognition that they were in this together, whether they'd planned it or not. That night after supper, Jonah didn't head immediately to the barn. Instead, he helped Mara clean up, the two of them working in companionable silence while the children played a noisy game of tag outside. Rose dozed in her basket, finally sleeping through enough of the night that Mara no longer looked like a ghost. "Jonah?" Mara's voice was tentative. "What you said earlier, about your family. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Not something I talk about much. Still, it must have been, I can't imagine. It was a long time ago." He dried a plate, set it aside. "But yeah, it was hard. Is that why you came west? To escape the memories?" "Partly. Mostly because there was nothing left for me there. The farm was gone. The town. Everyone I knew was dead or scattered. Starting over somewhere new seemed easier than trying to rebuild in a place full of ghosts." Mara was quiet for a moment, her hands stilling in the wash water. "I understand that. After James died, I wanted to leave Colorado so badly. Every street corner reminded me of him. Every place we'd been together felt haunted. But you stayed. Couldn't afford to leave. And then Sarah," her voice caught. "Sarah was going to be my escape. She was going to build a new life here, and we were going to join her, and it was going to be a fresh start for all of us. And then she died too." "Yes." Mara pulled her hands from the water, dried them slowly. "I thought about giving up then." "Thought about—" She stopped, glanced toward the children playing outside. "But they needed me, so I kept going." "You're stronger than you think." "I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm barely holding on most of the time." "Holding on when everything's falling apart, that's the definition of strength." Jonah set down his towel. "You've kept 5 children alive and fed for 14 months with no money and no help. You traveled hundreds of miles to keep a promise to your dying sister. You married a stranger to give your kids a chance at stability. That's not weakness, Mara." She turned to look at him fully, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You really believe that?" "Yes. Even though I almost ran today? Even though I was going to pack up and leave and— You didn't, though. You stayed. That's what matters." Mara wiped at her eyes impatiently. "I don't understand you, Jonah Mercer. Most men would have thrown us out after today. Would have decided I was too much trouble, too unstable, too— I'm not most men." "No." She smiled slightly, a real smile that reached her eyes. "No, you're not." They finished the dishes in comfortable silence. When Jonah finally headed toward the door, intending to make his usual trek to the barn, Mara's voice stopped him. "Jonah? You don't have to sleep in the barn anymore, if you don't want to." He froze, hand on the doorframe. "What?" "I mean, we're married, and it's cold out there, and it doesn't make sense for you to—" She was blushing now, her hands twisting in her apron. "You could take the supply room. It's not much, but it's warmer than the barn, and closer if the children need something in the night." It wasn't an invitation to share her bed, wasn't a declaration of affection or desire, but it was something. A small step toward actually being married instead of just play-acting at it. "All right," Jonah said. "Thank you. I'll put some blankets in there for you." She bustled off, clearly flustered by her own boldness. Jonah watched her go, feeling something warm unfurl in his chest. Not love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But something close to it. Fondness, perhaps. Or the beginning of real partnership. That night, Jonah slept inside the house for the first time since the wedding. The supply room was cramped and stuffy, but it was warm and dry and separated from Mara and the children by only a thin wall instead of 50 yards of darkness. He could hear them settling down for sleep, Mara's soft voice reading a story to the little ones, the girls giggling over something, Eli asking one last question about tomorrow's chores. It sounded like family, like home. On Sunday, Jonah did something he hadn't done since arriving in New Mexico territory. He went to church. The whole family piled into the wagon, the children scrubbed and dressed in their best clothes, which weren't much but were clean and mended. Mara had even found time to press Jonah's good shirt, and she wore a dress she'd remade from 2 old ones, the stitching careful and nearly invisible. They made an entrance, that was certain. The schoolhouse that served as the church went quiet when they walked in, every head turning to stare. Jonah felt Mara tense beside him, saw her chin lift in defiance even as her hand trembled on his arm. "Straight backs," he murmured to the children. "Heads up. We belong here as much as anyone." They filed into a pew near the back, the children pressed together, Jonah and Mara bookending them like protective walls. The service began, and Jonah felt the weight of judgment pressing down from all sides. Widow Hutchins sat 3 rows ahead, her disapproval radiating like heat. Chester Polk kept glancing back with barely concealed curiosity. The preacher, a thin man with kind eyes, spoke about mercy and compassion, about welcoming strangers and caring for widows and orphans. Jonah wondered if the irony was intentional, if the man had crafted his sermon specifically for this congregation who'd been gossiping about Jonah's household for weeks. After the service, people gathered outside as they always did, chatting and catching up on the week's news. Jonah started to lead his family straight to the wagon, but Mara stopped him. "No," she said quietly. "We stay. We're part of this community whether they like it or not." So they stayed, and it was excruciating. People made polite conversation that didn't quite include them. Children stared at Eli and his siblings with open curiosity. One woman, Martha from the restaurant, came over to speak to Mara about a quilting circle, but her invitation felt obligatory rather than genuine. Then Clara tugged on Jonah's hand. "Pa, that girl over there keeps staring at me." Jonah followed her gaze to a girl about Clara's age, blonde and freckled, who was indeed staring with undisguised interest. "Maybe she wants to be friends," Jonah suggested. "Or maybe she thinks I'm—" Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. "What the mean ladies say?" Before Jonah could respond, the blonde girl walked over, direct in the way only children can be. "Are you Clara?" she asked. Clara nodded warily. "I'm Susanna. I sit behind you in school." The girl looked Clara up and down. "My mama says your family is scandalous. Is that true?" "Susanna!" A woman rushed over, presumably the girl's mother, looking mortified. "That's not— you can't just— Well, you said it," Susanna pointed out with devastating logic. "I heard you tell Mrs. Hutchins that the Mercers were scandalous and probably not decent people." The woman's face went crimson. She looked like she wanted the earth to swallow her whole. I didn't mean— Are you decent people?" Susanna asked Clara, genuinely curious. Clara looked up at Jonah, uncertainty written all over her young face. He put a hand on her shoulder, felt her lean into it. "We're people," Clara said finally, her voice steady. "We're just people trying to be a family." Susanna considered this. "That sounds decent enough to me." She turned to her mother. "Can Clara come play at our house sometime?" I suppose." "Good." Susanna grabbed Clara's hand. "Come on, I'll show you the tree out back. It's perfect for climbing." The 2 girls ran off, leaving the adults standing in awkward silence. Susanna's mother looked at Mara with something that might have been apology. "Children," she said weakly, "they're so honest." "Yes," Mara agreed, her voice neutral. "They are. I should apologize for what I said. It was unkind." "But honest?" Mara's tone had an edge now. The woman flinched. "I don't know you. I don't know your situation. I shouldn't have made assumptions." "No," Jonah said quietly. "You shouldn't have." They left soon after, but something had shifted. A crack had appeared in the wall of judgment, small and fragile, but there. On the ride home, Clara chattered excitedly about Susanna, about the invitation to play, about maybe having a friend. "See?" Jonah said quietly to Mara. "We stay, we stand firm, and eventually people come around." "Or they don't?" Mara countered. "But at least we know we tried." That week, something else changed. Small things at first. Mara started smiling more easily, laughing at the children's antics instead of just managing them. She began asking Jonah's opinion not just on ranch matters, but on everything, treating him like a partner instead of just a provider. She stopped apologizing for every small thing, stopped acting like a guest in her own home. And Jonah found himself seeking her out, not because he needed something, but because he wanted her company. Found himself noticing small things, the way she hummed while cooking, the gentle patience she showed with Rose, the fierce protectiveness that flared whenever she thought her children were threatened. One evening, he came in from evening chores to find the house in an uproar. June was crying, Clara was shouting, and Mara was standing in the middle of it all looking frazzled and overwhelmed. "What happened?" Jonah asked. "June cut Clara's hair," Mara said, her voice tight, "with the kitchen shears, while Clara was sleeping." Jonah looked at Clara, who did indeed have a chunk of hair missing from one side, creating a lopsided disaster that would take months to grow out. "I wanted to help," June wailed. "She said it was too long and hot, and I thought... You thought you could fix it," Jonah finished. He crouched down to June's level. "That was kind of you, but cutting someone's hair without asking isn't helping. It's awful," Clara shouted. "I look horrible. Everyone at school will laugh at me." "No one's going to laugh," Mara said, but she didn't sound convinced. Jonah studied Clara's hair, turning her gently this way and that. Then he straightened and went to the supply room, returning with his own scissors. "Sit down," he told Clara. "What? Why?" "I'm going to even it out. Can't leave it lopsided." "You know how to cut hair?" Mara asked skeptically. "Cut my own for years, and other soldiers during the war. I'm not fancy, but I can make it even." 20 minutes later, Clara had a shorter haircut than she'd started the day with, but it was neat and actually quite flattering. She studied herself in the small mirror, touching the shortened strands with tentative fingers. "I don't look awful," she said wonderingly. "You look beautiful," Jonah said. "Just different." Clara threw her arms around him with enough force to nearly knock him over. "Thank you, Pa." Over her head, Jonah saw Mara watching with an expression that made his breath catch. Not quite love, not yet, but something warm and soft and wondering. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat on the porch in their usual spot. But this time, when Mara shivered in the cool air, Jonah didn't hesitate. He shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For today, for Clara. You didn't have to—" "Yes, I did. She's my daughter now." "Is she? Really? Not just legally, but in your heart?" Jonah thought about that. About Clara's excitement over Susanna's friendship, about Eli's pride in learning to ride, about Thomas's shy smiles, about June's endless chatter, about Rose's tiny hand wrapped around his finger. "Yes," he said. "Really?" Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I went to town yesterday, to the general store." "I know, you said." "I didn't tell you all of it." She pulled his coat tighter around herself. "Chester Polk was there. He said people are starting to come around, that maybe the Mercers aren't so scandalous after all, that we seem like a decent family." "That's good." "Is it?" She turned to look at him. "I mean, does it matter? What they think?" "Not really, but it matters for the kids. Makes their lives easier if the town accepts us." "That's what I thought too." Mara hesitated, then added softly, Chester said he'd never seen a man take to fatherhood the way you have. Said most men would have run for the hills, but you're all in. Didn't seem like there was any other way to be. There is, though. You could have married me and kept your distance from the children. Could have provided for them without loving them. But you don't. You love them like they're yours. They are mine. The words hung in the air between them, simple and true. Mara's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "When did that happen?" she asked. "When did they stop being my children and become ours?" Jonah thought back over the past weeks, the storm, the near drowning, the daily routines of teaching and caring and just being together. He couldn't pinpoint an exact moment. It had happened gradually, like snow accumulating, each small moment adding up until suddenly everything was transformed. "Don't know," he admitted. But it did. Mara reached out slowly and took his hand. Her fingers were warmer now, not trembling. "I'm glad we stayed, that I didn't run." "Me too." They sat in comfortable silence, hands joined, watching the stars emerge one by one. Inside the house, one of the children called out in their sleep. Mara started to rise, but Jonah stopped her. "I'll go." He found Thomas tangled in his blankets, whimpering softly. Jonah untangled him gently, tucked him back in, and sat on the edge of the bed until the boy settled back into sleep. When he turned to leave, he found Mara standing in the doorway, watching. "You're good at this," she whispered. "At what?" "Being a father. Being the man they need." Jonah moved toward the door, toward her. She didn't step back. They stood close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, could feel the warmth of her breath. "Mara." But whatever he'd been about to say was cut off by the sound of hoofbeats outside, urgent and fast. They both rushed to the window to see a rider approaching through the darkness, his horse lathered and blowing. Jonah grabbed his rifle and went to the door, Mara behind him. The rider pulled up in a spray of dust. It was young Tommy Fletcher from a neighboring ranch, his face pale in the lamplight. "Mr. Mercer, there's trouble in town. Fire at the general store. They're asking for anyone who can help to come quick. I'll saddle up." Jonah turned to Mara. "Keep the children inside, bar the door after I leave. Be careful." She caught his arm, her grip tight. "Please." He covered her hand with his briefly. "I will." But as he rode toward town through the darkness, following Tommy Fletcher's racing form, Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting again, that the fragile peace they'd been building was about to be tested in ways they hadn't prepared for. Behind him, at the ranch, Mara stood at the window watching until the darkness swallowed him completely, one hand pressed against the glass, the other clutching his coat that still held his warmth. Komye Sang Document, Part 5. The general store was an inferno by the time Jonah reached town, flames licking through the roof and belching black smoke into the night sky. Men were already forming bucket brigades from the town well, passing water hand to hand in a desperate attempt to save the surrounding buildings. The heat was intense even from a distance, pushing back against anyone who tried to get close. Jonah dismounted and immediately joined the line, his muscles falling into the rhythm of grab, pass, pass. Beside him worked Chester Polk, the town blacksmith. Even Widow Hutchins was there with her skirts tied up, her face smudged with ash. In a crisis like this, old grudges didn't matter. They were just people trying to save their town. "Anyone inside?" Jonah shouted over the roar of the flames. "Don't think so," the blacksmith yelled back. "Started after closing, but we can't be sure." The words were barely out of his mouth when a woman screamed from across the street. "My cat! Ginger was sleeping in the storeroom. Please, someone—" "It's just a cat, Martha," someone said, not unkindly. "Can't risk a life for—" But Martha was crying now, great heaving sobs. "She's all I have. My husband gave her to me before he died. Please." Jonah looked at the building, at the flames consuming it from the inside out, looked at Martha's desperate face, thought about Mara's voice saying, "Be careful," and the promise in it. He handed his bucket to the next man in line. "Jonah, don't," Chester warned. "It's not worth it." But Jonah was already moving, pulling his bandana up over his nose and mouth, soaking his shirt with water from a bucket. The heat hit him like a wall when he reached the door, and smoke poured out thick enough to choke on. He ducked low where the air was clearer and pushed inside. The interior was a hellscape. Flames danced across the ceiling, eating through wood and merchandise with terrifying speed. Jonah's eyes watered from the smoke, making it nearly impossible to see. He stumbled toward where he remembered the storeroom being, calling for the cat even though he felt like a fool. A yowl answered him from somewhere to his left. He turned, nearly tripped over a fallen beam, and found the cat huddled under a shelf, its eyes reflecting the firelight like coins. It hissed when he reached for it, swiping at his hands with claws extended. "Don't be stupid," Jonah growled, grabbing the animal by the scruff. It twisted and fought, scratching deep gouges in his forearms, but he held on. The ceiling groaned ominously. Jonah turned to run, but a section of roof collapsed directly in front of him, blocking the door. Flames roared up, cutting off his escape. His lungs were burning, his vision going dark at the edges. The cat yowled and struggled in his grip. He'd promised Mara he'd be careful, promised he wouldn't leave her a widow again. And here he was, about to die for a damn cat in a burning building while his wife and children waited at home. Then he heard shouting from outside, the crash of something heavy hitting the wall. A new opening appeared. Men had knocked through the back wall with axes. Hands reached for him, pulling him and the cat through the gap and into the blessed coolness of night air. Jonah collapsed on the ground, coughing so hard he thought his lungs might come up. Someone pried the cat from his death grip, and he heard Martha crying with relief. Someone else was pouring water over him, checking him for burns. "You stupid son of a bitch," Chester said, but his voice was thick with emotion. "Could have gotten yourself killed." "Cat's fine, though," Jonah managed between coughs. "Damn the cat! Your wife would have had my hide if I let you die in there." The word wife settled into Jonah's chest with strange warmth. His wife. When had that started feeling real? They saved the neighboring buildings, though the general store was a total loss. By the time the fire burned itself out, dawn was breaking pink and gold over the eastern hills. Jonah sat on the ground, his throat raw, his hands and arms a mess of burns and scratches, watching the first light paint the ruins. Martha came over with the cat, now clean and calm, purring in her arms. "Mr. Mercer, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't need thanks. You risked your life for her, for my Ginger." She was crying again, but softly now. "You're a good man. I don't care what anyone says." "What do people say?" Jonah asked, though he knew. Martha looked uncomfortable. "Well, there's been talk about you and Mrs. Mercer, about the circumstances of your marriage. Some folks—" She stopped, squared her shoulders. "Some folks are small-minded gossips who have nothing better to do than judge others. You're a good man, and she's a good woman, and those children are lucky to have you both." She walked away before he could respond, leaving Jonah sitting in the ash and ruin, bleeding and exhausted and strangely moved. The ride home took forever. Jonah's horse plodded along while he swayed in the saddle, fighting to stay conscious. His burns were starting to throb, his throat felt like he'd swallowed broken glass, and every breath tasted of smoke. But he was alive. He'd made it through another crisis, another close call. He was starting to wonder if he had the devil's own luck, or if God just had a sick sense of humor. The ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun climbed higher, and Jonah felt something in his chest ease at the sight of it. Home. When had this place become home? When had the thought of it mean more than just a roof and walls? Mara must have been watching for him because she came running out of the house before he'd even dismounted, her face pale with worry. The children poured out behind her, all 5 of them, even Rose in Clara's arms. "Jonah!" Mara reached him as he slid off the horse, catching him when he stumbled. "Oh God, you're hurt! What happened? Are you at—" "I'm fine," he croaked, though the evidence clearly suggested otherwise. "You're not fine. You're covered in burns and blood, and you smell like— Eli, get water. Clara, bring clean cloths. Thomas, take the horse to the barn." She was in full crisis mode, organizing with the efficiency of a general. "Come on, let's get you inside." She half carried him to the house, stronger than her small frame suggested, and deposited him in a chair by the table. The children hovered anxiously while Mara began the painful process of cleaning his wounds. "The fire?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "They saved the other buildings. General store's gone, though." "And you? What did you do that left you looking like you went to hell and back?" "Went into the burning building," Jonah admitted. Mara's hands stilled. When she spoke again, her voice was dangerously quiet. "You went into a burning building. There was a cat." A cat. She was trembling now, whether with fear or fury he couldn't tell. "You nearly died for a cat." "It was Martha Simmons's cat. She was crying." "I don't care if it was the King of England's cat." Mara's control snapped. "You promised me. You promised you wouldn't—" Her voice broke completely and she pressed her hands to her face, shoulders shaking with sobs. Jonah reached for her instinctively, pulling her into his arms despite his injuries. She resisted for a moment, then collapsed against his chest, crying with the kind of desperate fear that only comes after the danger has passed. "I'm sorry," he murmured into her hair. "I'm sorry. I'm here. I'm all right. You could have died. You could have left us, and—" She pulled back, her face streaked with tears and fury. "Don't you understand? We need you. Not as a provider or a name on paper. We need you. The children need their father. I need—" She stopped, something shifting in her expression. "What do you need?" Jonah asked softly. Mara looked at him, really looked at him, and Jonah saw the exact moment something broke open in her. "You," she whispered. "I need you." The words hung in the air between them, huge and terrifying and true. The children had gone very quiet, sensing the importance of this moment, even if they didn't fully understand it. "Mara, I'm in love with you." She said it like a confession, like something shameful and wonderful all at once. "I don't know when it happened. Maybe when you took Eli out in that storm, or when you cut Clara's hair, or when you sat up all night with Rose when she was sick, or maybe it was 100 small moments all adding up to this. But I love you, Jonah Mercer, and the thought of losing you—" Jonah kissed her, just leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, cutting off the flow of words with action because he didn't have the words himself. She made a small sound of surprise, then melted into him, her hands coming up to frame his face with a gentleness that made his chest ache. They broke apart to the sound of June giggling and Eli making exaggerated gagging noises. Clara was grinning, Thomas looked confused, and Rose, oblivious to the drama, was trying to eat her own foot. "Does this mean you love Ma too?" June asked Jonah. Jonah looked at Mara, at this woman who'd crashed into his life and upended everything, who'd brought chaos and noise and 5 children and made his empty house into a home. "Yes," he said simply. "I love her too." "Took you long enough," Eli said, his voice thick with emotion despite his attempt at nonchalance. "We've been waiting for you two to figure it out for weeks." "You have?" Mara asked. "Ma, it was obvious." Clara rolled her eyes with all the exasperation a 9-year-old could muster. "You look at each other all the time, and Pa smiles more when you're around, and you stop crying when he holds your hand." "Very observant," Jonah said dryly. "So what happens now?" Thomas asked. "Are you going to get married again?" "We're already married, you goose," Clara told him. "But now it's real," June announced with the absolute certainty of a 4-year-old. "Now they love each other like in the stories." Mara laughed, a sound of pure joy that Jonah had never heard from her before. "Yes," she said, looking at Jonah with eyes full of wonder. "Now it's real." The next few days passed in a blur of healing and adjustment. Jonah's burns scabbed over, his throat stopped feeling like raw meat, and the scratches from the cat faded to thin pink lines. But something more fundamental had healed too. The distance between him and Mara, the careful walls they'd both maintained, had crumbled completely. She moved into the supply room with him, bringing her few belongings and her endless capacity for reorganization. It was cramped and awkward at first, 2 people learning to share space they'd both been using as fortresses. But Jonah found he didn't mind the lack of privacy, the way she hummed while brushing her hair at night, the warmth of another body beside his in the darkness. "Tell me about James," he said one night when they were lying in the narrow bed pressed close by necessity. Mara stiffened. "Why?" "Because he was important to you. Because the children loved him. I want to know about the man who came before me." She was quiet for so long Jonah thought she might not answer. Then, "He was kind. Not always practical, sometimes too dreamy for his own good, but genuinely kind. He loved the children fiercely. Even when he struggled, even when the drinking got bad, he loved them." "And you?" "I loved him too. But it wasn't—" She paused, searching for words. "It wasn't easy, the way I thought marriage would be. We fought about money, about his choices, about whether to keep trying or give up, and then he died, and I felt guilty for all the times I'd been angry at him." "That's natural." "Is it?" "Because some days I was so angry I wished he'd just leave. And then he did leave permanently, and I got what I wished for." Her voice was thick with old grief and guilt. Jonah pulled her closer. "That's not how wishing works. His death wasn't your fault." "Logically, I know that, but hearts aren't logical." "No," Jonah agreed. "They're not." She turned in his arms to face him. "When you talk about your family, your parents, your sisters, do you feel guilty too, for surviving when they didn't?" The question hit unexpectedly deep. Jonah thought about it, about the weight he'd carried for years. "Yes. For a long time I thought I should have been there, should have died with them instead of being off at war." "But you don't think that anymore?" "I think—" He paused, working through thoughts he'd never fully articulated. "I think maybe I survived for a reason. Maybe to build this. To be here for you and the children. Maybe all that pain and loss was leading me to this moment." "That's a nice thought." Or maybe it's all random and meaningless, and we're just trying to make sense of senseless things. Jonah stroked her hair, feeling the silk of it under his fingers. Either way, I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Promise? I promise. On Sunday, they went to church again, and this time when they walked in, several people actually smiled. Susanna's mother invited them for Sunday dinner. The preacher shook Jonah's hand warmly and thanked him for his bravery during the fire. Even Widow Hutchins managed a stiff nod of acknowledgement. After the service, Martha Simmons approached with Ginger, the cat, in her arms. Mrs. Mercer, I wanted to thank you properly for what your husband did. You should thank him, not me, Mara said. Oh, I have, many times, but I also wanted to say… Martha looked uncomfortable. I wanted to say I'm sorry for the way I acted when you first arrived, for not offering help when you clearly needed it. I was judging you without knowing you, and that was wrong. Mara blinked in surprise. Thank you. That means a lot. The town's been talking, Martha continued, about what a good father Mr. Mercer is to your children, about how you've made that old ranch house into a real home, about how those youngsters are thriving under your care. She smiled. Good people doing their best, that's worth celebrating, not tearing down. Other women began to drift over, offering similar sentiments. Some were clearly prompted by guilt over their earlier gossip, but others seemed genuinely warm. Clara was invited to join a group of girls her age. Eli found himself talking horses with some of the local ranchers' sons. Even June made friends with the little girl who had a doll collection. On the ride home, the children chattered excitedly about their new connections, their voices overlapping in a joyful cacophony that made Jonah's ears ring and his heart swell. They're happy, Mar said quietly, watching them with soft eyes. They are. I never thought, after everything we went through, I never thought we'd be here, that they'd have friends and a home and a father who, her voice caught. You've given them everything I couldn't. We've given them everything together, Jonah corrected. You kept them alive and loved and hoping when you had nothing. I just gave you a place to land. You gave us much more than that. That night, after the children were asleep, Jonah and Mara sat on the porch, in what had become their sacred space. The stars were brilliant overhead, the air sweet with the smell of sage and possibility. I have something to tell you, Mara said. Jonah felt a flutter of concern. What? I went to see the doctor in town. Yesterday, when I took the eggs to sell. She took his hand, placed it on her still flat stomach. We're going to have a baby. In the winter, probably February. Jonah's mind went blank with shock. A baby, their baby. Not inherited, not acquired through circumstance, but created together out of love and commitment and all the nights they'd spent learning each other. How do you feel about it? He managed. Terrified, Mara admitted. 6 children, Jonah. We're going to have 6 children. That's a lot of chaos. We're already outnumbered, Jonah pointed out. What's one more? That startled a laugh out of her. You're taking this remarkably well. Am I? He pulled her into his arms, feeling the rightness of her there. I'm terrified too, but I'm happy, Mara. Really happy. Even though this wasn't the plan. The plan was I'd marry a school teacher and have a quiet life. That worked out real well. He kissed her temple. I'm done making plans. I'm just going to take what comes and be grateful for it. Even if what comes is me getting huge and irritable and craving bizarre foods at midnight? Even then. They sat together in the darkness, contemplating this new twist in their already complicated story. Inside the house, Rose started crying, and they heard Eli's voice soothing her, the boy taking on the role of big brother with ease. A coyote called in the distance, lonely and wild. The cattle shifted in the near pasture, settling for the night. Tell me something, Mara said. When you were writing to Sarah, what did you dream about? What did you think your life would be like? Jonah thought back to those letters, to the careful hopes he'd built line by line. I thought it would be quiet, orderly. 2 people sharing space but not necessarily building anything together. A partnership of convenience that made the loneliness bearable. That sounds sad. It was sad. I was sad. He tightened his arms around her. But this chaos you brought with you, it's not sad at all. It's loud and messy and exhausting, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Not even for quiet? Especially not for quiet. Quiet's just another word for empty. Summer gave way to fall, and the ranch transformed under their combined efforts. Jonah and Eli built the shelter on the high ground, exactly as the boy had envisioned it. Clara started a garden that produced more vegetables than they could eat, so Mara preserved them for winter. Thomas learned to milk the goat they'd acquired, though he complained constantly about it. June appointed herself chief chicken tender when they finally got a flock, naming each bird and treating them like pets. And Rose grew, fat and happy and laughing, reaching for Jonah with the same ease she reached for Mara. The town continued to soften toward them. Invitations arrived for barn raisings and quilting bees and harvest celebrations. Clara's friendship with Susanna deepened into something genuine. Eli was invited to work part-time at the livery stable, earning his own money and swelling with pride. Even the judgmental whispers faded to background noise, replaced by grudging acceptance and then something approaching respect. "They're calling you the widow's salvation," Mara told Jonah one day, laughing as she relayed the latest gossip. "Apparently you're a hero for taking in a desperate woman and her children." "That's not how it happened." "I know, I was there." She came to him, wrapped her arms around his waist, her belly just starting to show the evidence of their child. "But let them have their stories. It makes them feel better about how badly they treated us at first." "Generous of you." "I'm feeling generous. Must be the baby making me soft." In October, Chester Polk came by with an offer. The general store was being rebuilt, and they wanted to hire Mara to run it. The pay wasn't much, but it would give them a cushion of security, a buffer against the uncertainties of ranching. "What do you think?" Mara asked Jonah that night. "I think it's your decision. You want to work in town?" "I like the idea of contributing, of having something that's mine, separate from being a mother and wife." She looked uncertain. "But I don't want to neglect the children. Or you. The children are old enough to help more around here, and me." He pulled her close. "I'm not so fragile I'll fall apart if you have something of your own." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." So Mara took the job, and 3 days a week she drove the wagon to town and ran the new general store with the same efficiency she ran the household. The children adapted, taking on more chores, learning independence. Jonah found himself cooking supper sometimes, teaching himself from Mara's careful notes, burning things occasionally, but improving with practice. It was good for all of them, this expansion beyond the narrow boundaries they'd started with. Good to prove they could flex and change and accommodate new realities without breaking. In November, the first snow fell. Jonah woke to find the world transformed to white, pristine, and beautiful and cold. Beside him, Mara slept heavily, her pregnancy making her exhausted in ways she never had been with the first 5 children. He slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake her, and went to check on the children. They were all still asleep. Eli and Thomas in their room, Clara and June in theirs, Rose in her cradle by Mara's bed. 6 souls in his care, soon to be 7. The weight of it should have been crushing, but somehow it wasn't. Somehow it felt like the exact right amount of purpose, the exact right measure of love and responsibility. He started the fire, made coffee, and was scrambling eggs when small arms wrapped around his leg. June, barefoot and wild-haired, looking up at him with sleepy eyes. "Morning, Pa." "Morning, little one. You're up early." "Couldn't sleep. Too excited about the snow." She climbed into a chair. "Can we build a snowman after breakfast?" "If you want." "A big one? Bigger than Eli?" "We'll see what we can manage." The others drifted in one by one, drawn by the smell of food and the promise of a snow day. Mara came last, moving slowly, one hand on her lower back. "You should have woken me," she said, but she was smiling. "I could have made breakfast. You're growing a person. I think I can handle eggs." They ate together, the children planning elaborate snow forts and sledding runs, their voices bright with anticipation. After breakfast, they bundled into every piece of warm clothing they owned and tumbled out into the fresh snow like puppies. Jonah and Eli built the promised snowman, a towering creation that did indeed surpass Eli's height, while Clara and June made snow angels. Thomas tried to build an igloo and ended up just making a lumpy pile. Rose watched from inside, her face pressed to the window, Mara holding her up to see. In that moment, with snow falling and children laughing and his wife smiling at him through the window, Jonah felt something settle deep in his chest. Contentment, maybe. Or peace. Or just the simple recognition that this messy, chaotic, beautiful thing was exactly what he'd been looking for all along, even when he hadn't known to look for it. That night, cold and exhausted and happy, they gathered around the fire. Jonah told stories about his childhood in Tennessee, about his sisters and the farm and the life he'd lost. Mara told stories about James, about Colorado, about Sarah and their childhood together. The children listened with rapt attention, learning about the people and places that had shaped their parents into who they were now. "We should write it all down," Clara suggested, "so we remember. So when Rose is older, she'll know where she came from." "That's a good idea," Mara agreed. "Family history matters." "Are we a real family now?" Thomas asked. "Or are we still just pretending?" The question, so innocently asked, hung heavy in the warm air. Jonah looked at Mara, saw his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. "What do you think makes a family real?" he asked Thomas. The boy considered this seriously. I think it's when people love each other and take care of each other and stay even when things are hard." "Then yes," Jonah said, "we're a real family." "The realest," June declared with utter certainty. Winter deepened, and Mara's pregnancy became more obvious. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying precious cargo, one hand always on her belly. The baby was active, keeping her awake at night with kicks and rolls that Jonah could feel when he laid his hand on her skin. "Strong," he murmured one night, feeling a particularly vigorous kick. "Takes after its father," Mara said, "stubborn and determined. Or its mother, fierce and unstoppable." She laughed, then winced. "I forgot how uncomfortable this part is. With the others, I had James to complain to. Now I have you. Complain all you want. My back aches, my feet are swollen. I can't sleep. The baby keeps kicking my ribs. I have to pee constantly, and I'm so tired all the time. Anything else?" "Probably, but I'm too tired to remember." Jonah kissed her forehead. "You're doing great. I'm miserable. You can be both." In January, a blizzard hit that made the autumn snow look like child's play. They were trapped inside for 3 days, the wind howling like demons, and the snow piling so high against the house they had to dig their way out to reach the barn. The children grew restless and cranky, cooped up in close quarters with nothing to do. On the second day, Eli and Clara got into a fight over something trivial that escalated into shouting. Thomas cried because he was bored. June whined about everything. Even Rose seemed fussier than usual, picking up on the general tension. Jonah found Mara in the supply room, crying quietly, her hands on her enormous belly. "What's wrong? Is it the baby?" "It's everything," she sobbed. "They won't stop fighting, and I'm so tired, and I can't do this anymore, Jonah. I can't be trapped in here with all of them needing me, and no escape, and hey. He pulled her into his arms as best he could around her belly. "It's all right. It's just cabin fever. The storm will pass. But what if it doesn't? What if this is our life now, trapped and arguing and miserable?" 3 days, Mara. It's been 3 days. We've survived worse." She pulled back, wiping her eyes. "Have we? You survived 14 months alone with 5 kids and no money. I survived Shiloh. We can survive a blizzard and some cranky children." That pulled a watery laugh from her. "When did you become the optimistic one?" "When I married you. Apparently your chaos is contagious." He gathered the children and instituted new rules. Quiet time in the afternoons, taking turns with activities, helping more with chores to burn off energy. He told longer stories at night, taught them card games, carved small toys from scraps of wood. By the 3rd day, the tension had eased, replaced by a kind of siege mentality where they were all in it together. When the storm finally broke and they could dig out, it felt like emerging from a cave into sunlight. The world was white and pristine and blindingly bright. The children exploded outside with renewed energy, and Mara stood at the window watching them with a smile. "We made it," she said. "We did. Together." That's the only way anything works. In February, on a morning so cold the water in the basin froze overnight, Mara went into labor. Jonah sent Eli riding for the midwife while he tried to keep Mara comfortable and the other children calm. Clara took charge of the little ones with impressive competence, while Jonah held Mara's hand and felt utterly helpless. "I've done this 5 times, Mara panted between contractions. "You'd think it would get easier." "Is it easier?" "Not even a little bit." The midwife arrived, a capable woman named Mrs. Chen, who delivered half the babies in the territory. She shooed Jonah out of the room with brisk efficiency, leaving him to pace the main room while the children watched with wide eyes. "Is Ma going to die?" June asked in a small voice. "No," Jonah said firmly, praying he was right. "She's strong. She'll be fine." "But babies can be dangerous. My friend Susanna said her aunt died having a baby." "Your Ma's not going to die." He pulled June into his lap, then extended an arm to gather in the others. "She's going to be fine, and we're going to have a new brother or sister, and everything's going to be all right." "Promise?" Thomas asked. Jonah thought about all the promises he'd made. To Mara, to the children, to himself. Thought about how many times life had proven that promises were fragile things, easily broken by circumstance and tragedy. But he also thought about how sometimes you had to promise anyway, had to speak faith into existence and trust it would hold. "I promise," he said. The labor lasted through the day and into the evening. Jonah heard Mara crying out and wanted to break down the door, wanted to do something, anything, to help. But all he could do was wait and keep the children calm and pray to a God he wasn't sure was listening. Finally, as the sun was setting in streaks of orange and crimson, a baby's cry pierced the air, strong and healthy and indignant at being forced into the cold world. Mrs. Chen emerged, looking tired but satisfied. "You have a son, Mr. Mercer. Healthy, good weight. Mother's tired but well." Jonah sagged with relief. Give us a few minutes to clean them up. Then you can come in." When he finally entered the room, he found Mara propped up on pillows, exhausted and sweaty and radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up when he came in, and her smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Come meet your son," she said. Jonah crossed to the bed, his legs feeling strangely unsteady. The baby was tiny, red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that couldn't quite focus yet. But when Jonah touched his small hand, the tiny fingers wrapped around his larger one with surprising strength. "He's perfect," Jonah whispered. "He looks like you," Mara said. "Same stubborn chin." "Poor kid." She laughed, then winced. "Don't make me laugh. Everything hurts." "What are we going to name him?" Mara looked down at the baby, considering. "I was thinking, if you don't mind, Samuel, after my father, but call him Sam." "Sam Mercer." Jonah tested the name, found it fit. "I like it." "Should we introduce him to his siblings?" They called the children in, and one by one they approached the bed to meet their new brother. Clara touched his tiny hand with reverent wonder. Eli looked proud and protective. Thomas seemed confused about how something so small could be a person. June demanded to hold him immediately. Even Rose, passed from Eli's arms to look, reached out to pat the baby's head with gentle curiosity. "This is Sam," Mara told them. "Your brother." "Our real brother?" June asked. "Or our family brother, like we're all family?" "Both," Jonah said. "He's both." That night, with Mara and the baby sleeping peacefully and the children finally settled after hours of excitement, Jonah stood on the porch looking at the stars. The same stars he'd looked at that first night when Mara had arrived, when his life had been upended and his future uncertain. He'd been so angry then, so confused and overwhelmed. He'd asked for a quiet life and gotten chaos, asked for a partner and gotten a family, asked for simple and gotten complicated beyond measure. And he'd gotten everything he'd ever needed, even though he hadn't known to want it. The door opened behind him, and Eli came out, wrapped in a blanket against the cold. "Can't sleep?" Jonah asked. "Too much happening." The boy came to stand beside him. "Pa, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you ever miss it, the quiet, before we came and made everything loud and messy?" Jonah thought about it honestly. About those years of solitude, the echo of his own footsteps in an empty house, the silence that had felt like safety but was really just loneliness wearing a mask. "No," he said. "I don't miss it at all." "Really? Not even a little?" "Not even a little. You know what I realized? I was alive before you all came, but I wasn't living. There's a difference." Eli processed this, his young face serious in the starlight. "I'm glad we came here. I'm glad you married Ma. I know it wasn't what you planned, but it was better than anything I could have planned," Jonah interrupted. "Sometimes the best things are the ones we never see coming." "That's what Ma says, too." They stood together in comfortable silence, father and son in all the ways that mattered, watching the stars wheel overhead. Inside the house, a baby cried, "Sam," wanting his mother. They heard Mara's soft voice soothing him, the creak of the rocking chair. "We should get some sleep," Jonah said finally. "Tomorrow's going to be busy." "Tomorrow's always busy now," Eli said, but he was smiling. "I kind of like it that way." "Me too, son. Me too." Spring came with a rush of green and wild flowers, the desert blooming in shades of purple and gold. Sam grew fat and happy, his cries filling the house with the particular chaos only a baby could bring. The older children adapted to their new sibling with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Clara loved helping with him. Eli was protective. Thomas was indifferent. June was jealous, but trying to hide it. The ranch prospered. The cattle multiplied, the crops grew, the chickens laid eggs in abundance. Mara continued working at the general store, bringing Sam with her in a basket until he got too big and wiggly, then leaving him with Jonah on her work days. Jonah discovered he was surprisingly good at managing a baby and a ranch simultaneously, though it required more creativity than he'd anticipated. The town had fully accepted them by now. The Mercers were just another family, no more scandalous than anyone else. Clara and Susanna were inseparable. Eli had a whole gang of friends from the livery stable. Even the gossips had found new targets, moved on to fresh scandals. On a warm evening in May, Jonah and Mara sat on their porch, their sacred space, watching the children play in the yard. Sam was asleep in Mara's arms, his small face peaceful. In the distance, the mountains rose purple against the sunset sky. "Happy?" Jonah asked. Mara smiled, that particular smile that was just for him. "Deliriously. You?" "More than I ever thought possible." She leaned against his shoulder and they sat in the comfortable silence of people who'd learned to communicate without words. Inside the house, Rose started fussing and Clara went to soothe her. Thomas and June were arguing over some imagined slight. Eli was teaching one of the horses a new trick, his voice patient and encouraging. It was loud. It was chaotic. It was everything Jonah had never known he wanted. "I've been thinking," Mara said eventually, "about that first day when I stepped off that wagon and saw your face. You looked like I'd just ruined your life." "I thought you had," Jonah admitted. "And now?" "Now I think you saved it. Saved me from a life of existing instead of living, from being alone when I could have been surrounded by love." He kissed her temple. "You gave me everything, Mara. You and these kids, you're everything I needed and didn't know to ask for." "We're a lot of work," she warned. "You're worth it. Even when we're loud and messy and demanding, especially then." The sun sank lower, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. The children's laughter carried on the warm air, mixing with the calls of night birds and the gentle lowing of cattle settling for the evening. Sam stirred in Mara's arms but didn't wake. "Tell me something," Mara said. "If you could go back to that day, if you could change it so that Sarah had lived and came instead of me, would you?" Jonah didn't have to think about it. "No." "Really? Not even for the quiet life you wanted?" "I didn't know what I wanted. I thought I did, but I was wrong. What I wanted was this, was you and these beautiful, chaotic children and a home full of love instead of silence. I just didn't have the imagination to want it before you showed up and gave it to me anyway." Mara's eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you, Jonah Mercer. More than I thought I could love anyone again, more than I thought my broken heart was capable of." "I love you too. And your heart's not broken anymore. It's just bigger, big enough for all of us." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Jonah thought about the journey that had brought them here, the loss and loneliness, the desperate choices and unexpected grace, the slow building of trust into love. He thought about Sarah, who'd never made it but whose sacrifice had somehow led him to exactly where he needed to be. He thought about James, who'd loved Mara first and given her these children that Jonah now cherished as his own. And he thought about the future, about watching these children grow, about growing old with Mara beside him, about the ranch expanding and the family thriving and all the small moments of joy and frustration that made up a life worth living. The loner rancher had waited for his mail-order bride and gotten something infinitely better. A wife who challenged and loved him, children who filled his empty spaces, and a home that echoed with laughter instead of silence. What had started as obligation had transformed into devotion. What had been duty had become choice. And in the end, that was the greatest gift of all. Not the romance he'd planned for, but the family he'd built from unexpected pieces, creating something whole and beautiful from what had seemed like disaster. Inside the house, June called out that she was hungry. Thomas complained about being tired. Rose started crying in earnest now, wanting her mother. The peaceful moment shattered into the usual chaos of bedtime routines and competing needs. Mara stood with a sigh, Sam still sleeping against her shoulder. Duty calls. Let me help. Jonah rose too, taking her hand. Together they went inside to manage the beautiful mayhem of their life. And as Jonah heated milk and Mara soothed Rose and the older children argued about whose turn it was for what, he felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was home. This noise, this chaos, this overwhelming abundance of love. This was everything. And it was more than enough.